أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to Mizan for organizing this. It's kind of a long-standing ambition of mine or hope of mine to be invited to the UK to speak because my mother did her PhD here in Cambridge. My grandmother did her PhD at Oxford. My aunt did her master's at Oxford. My sister did her undergraduate at St. Andrews. And my family has this long history of coming to the UK, and we have all sorts of Charles and Diana tea sets in our house and biscuits and things like that. So we kind of live in this, Anglo-American immigrants to America who live in the sort of cultural shade of the motherland, and yet I have only come here once or twice in my life and have never been to these places that where my family studied and that they respect so much. So to be invited to speak at British universities is kind of I've always longed for this affirmation. So thank you very much for organizing everything. I had, Mizan will probably be annoyed if I mention this, but I sort of disputed with him about the topic. And this is not going to be a good, I don't want you to take this as a non-endorsement of what I'm going to speak about, but I actually don't think the topic that I'm speaking about is the appropriate topic. I don't want you to take this the wrong way. What I mean to say is, when we study the way that Western scholars look at the Hadith tradition, I think that you can very easily fall into this maybe unproductive circle of looking at their methods and trying to, you say, I want to refute what they're saying about Hadith. But often, I think what you'll come up with eventually, or come to a certain realization, is that disagreements over the reliability of the Islamic tradition, Hadith being part of it, is not something that can be resolved through discussion or presentation of evidence, because it ultimately stems from different premises and assumptions, and that those assumptions cannot be reconciled without a deeper understanding of where they come from. And they may not be reconcilable ever, but the point is that you end up having a conversation which might never able to be actually taken anywhere. And so my real interest when I look at the topic of Western study of Islam is really to look at what the West is. What is the West? Where does it come from? What is the concept of, what is a Western perspective on anything? And where does that perspective come from? When Mizan and I were talking about this movie that came out about the origins of Islam, which I haven't seen because somehow these websites don't work in the United States, but looking at the images and the pictures and reading about it, where is this? Why is this person making a movie? Why is there this image of this British guy with a hat sitting and talking to Bedouins and going to the pyramids and things like that? And why is this somehow going to tell us about the origins of Islam? And why is he doing this? What is this? This is a long tradition. These images are all rooted in some discourse tradition about the West and uncovering the origins of religion and of other people's religion and of their own religion. And it's studying that universe that fascinates me. So I had a whole set of slides shows about this, and then Mizan said, no, you have to talk about this issue of Orientalism and Hadith, and I said, okay, fine, I'll talk about that. But if somebody says, we really are sick of this topic, we don't want to talk about this, and we want you to do the other slides, I'll be happy. But I understand, I'm here to serve the desires and the wishes of the community here, so I won't object. I'll just say that I think that there's another conversation which is more important and more interesting, but I will be happy to do my best to answer these questions. And they are important questions. What I'm trying to say is I think that there's a bigger conversation behind them, which I'm sure we'll get into. So this is an image of Egypt from the 1920s. And I think the reason I have it up here is because this is really the time when a lot of these Orientalists, the first generation of really successful, thorough Orientalists are writing about the Muslim tradition, and some of them are writing in Egypt. This is something that people don't know about, but in Egypt in the 1920s and 1930s, European scholars of Islam were put on when the Majma al-Lugha al-Arabiya, the Council of the Academy of the Arabic Language, was founded. A fourth of its seats were reserved for European scholars. And this would not happen today. I mean, imagine having in Egypt, the Council of the Arabic Language or study of Islam, and a fourth or a third or a fifth even of the members are European scholars who are not Muslim. This would be very inconceivable today. But Orientalists were, at the time, in the early 20th century, and even in the late 19th century, especially in India, they were really looked to by Muslim governments, by modernizing states like Egypt, like the British imperial authority in India, as people who were going to actually tell Muslims how to understand their religion, and that Muslims were going to listen to them. And some Muslims, at least, were out there saying, yes, we would like you to tell us about our religion. Now, there was a great protest about some of the people who were on this Arabic Language Academy in the 1930s when it was founded. Rashid Rida really objected to EventSync, for example, being on the council, and eventually he was the invitation was rescinded for him because of some of the things he had written about Islam. But this is interesting. I mean, I was very surprised to find out that these generation of Orientalists that we speak about sometimes very critically, when we talk about people like Goldziher and EventSync and Lamens, I mean, they were for many people, I wouldn't say a majority, but there were institutions and people in places like Egypt that really looked to them as authorities about Islam to tell Muslims about their religion. Okay. So when we talk about the Western study of Hadith, we are talking about the application of a critical method to a scriptural tradition. And the handy term which we can use to describe this critical method is the historical critical method, or HCM. This is a very internally diverse method. It's more of a kind of toolkit, an approach. It's not a method that you would use, let's say, to prepare your taxes or something, where there's a very regimented system of you have to fill out a form or something like that. It's not a method in that sense. It's really an approach, a mindset, a set of tools, a set of assumptions. And this is something that is produced or that emerges in Western Europe, in Italy and France, later in Germany and Great Britain, from the 1300s until the 19th century. It's a long period of development. It's a product of the Western tradition. It's something that comes out of Western European Christian intellectual tradition from the Renaissance onward. And this, I can't stress this enough. People are not born, someone doesn't pop out of his or her mother's belly and look at a text and say, oh, I'm going to approach it from a historical critical method perspective, or from another perspective. People don't just look at religion or think about text or think about the past or think about claims about the past in any way automatically. The way they think about these issues is conditioned by their cultural environment. And this is very important because for many people in the West, whatever that is, and for many Muslims who are confronted by the West, there's, I think, an assumption that this is just the way that people should think about religion or should think about history. And that there's something weird or wrong with Muslims that they think about it differently, and that Muslims have to justify why they think about history or religion in the way they do, or defend that. But it could just as easily be turned around. Why is it that this fellow who made this movie about the origins of Islam, why is it that he thinks about the religion the way he does? Why is there some origins of Islam that's different than what Muslims think it is? Why did someone come up with this assumption? Why do you have to go and talk to Bedouins and put on a hat and go into the desert to try and find what the origins of Islam are? I mean, that's seems to me to be a very odd assumption to start with. So you can't. It's very important we start this discussion that the playing field be level. That we not start the discussion with the assumption that the way that quote unquote Westerners think about religion is correct. Muslims have to justify why they think about the religion in a different way. These are different approaches, neither of which is necessarily correct. I mean, if you're a Martian and you're observing the Earth, there's no reason to think that the way Muslims think about religion or history, is any more or less correct than the way Westerners do. They're just different approaches. In fact, one of them, the historical critical method approach, is much newer. Now, there's a couple of, I'm just going to go through some very important principles. I would love to spend 5 hours just talking about the history of where these things come from and why they emerged and how the weird mixture of rediscovering Greek history and Roman literature and the Protestant Reformation and Aristotelian science, how this all, and discovering the New World and finding out that there are tribes in Brazil who have no idea what God is, or the West Abrahamic notion of God is, how all these things came together to create this approach. I would love to do that. I won't have time. One of the important principles that comes out of the emergence of the historical critical method is what's called the principle of analogy. This is very, very important. What this means is, basically, human society is always the same. Human society is always the same. Whether you're in Greece, in Athens in 400 BC, or Arabia in 600 BC, or China in 1000 BC, or England in the 1800s, people are always the same. And they are the same in a negative way. They are self-interested, they are greedy, they manipulate power, they are dishonest, they pursue their own agendas, they twist ideas and beliefs to meet these agendas. It's a cynical vision of humanity that is really, I think, based in the Greco-Roman historical tradition. Historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, later Roman historians like Polybius, who died around 110, 115 BC, who's a Roman historian. And what they say is, a historian, and here I'm quoting Polybius in his History of the Roman Empire, a historian, or the history of Rome up to his time, remember he's writing the 115, 120 BC, relatively early, is that a historian has to be ready to praise his enemies and criticize his friends, because nobody is always right and nobody is always wrong. This is very important. I know this sounds, well, that's so important about what Dr. Brown is saying. It's actually a very important principle. What it means is that there is no community or group of people or time that is perfect or golden or free from criticism or better than any other time. And the Greek and Greco-Roman view of history was a cyclical. There was no beginning of the world. There was no end of the world. There's no better time. There's no worse time. It's just constant circle of fate. The circle of fate, literally. Rotam fortunae, the circle of fate. Going over, rota fortunae, going over, around and around and around. Nothing changes. This is very important because when you're studying, if I decide I'm going to go and try and discover how Muslims were living or thinking in the year 700 in Damascus, I'm going to assume that their world basically works according to the same rules as my world right now. Now, there are differences. I can say, okay, when an Arab says, when an Arab says, I verily, this thing is worth a camel to me. I'm just making this up. I can say, well, camels aren't very, very valuable today. What does this means? He doesn't think camels are important. He doesn't think this thing is important. No, maybe camels are very important to him, so he's saying this is extremely important to me. Right? So I'm not trying to say human beings are always the same in every sense, but adjusted for time and place, adjusted for idiom and language, adjusted for lifestyle, that person will be motivated by the same things that motivate me or anyone else. Is this clear? Now, this is very important because it's completely different than the way Muslims think about their history. Is every time and every place equal? Is there a time and a place that is treated differently in the way we think about it historically? Can anyone think of an example?
Classical Islam, I mean, the time of the companions.
The time of the Prophet and the companions, exactly. The Prophet says that the best, Salam says the best generation is the one in which I was sent, then the one after it, then the one after it. And as later scholars, one scholar in the 1300s named Al-Kirmani, who did a famous sharh of Sahih al-Bukhari, he says, this was a time of the Prophet and the companions who was free of evil, free of evil. And you can't look at it. You can't look at from the Sunni perspective. From the Sunni perspective, and I acknowledge that there's Imami Shiite perspective, there's a Zaydi Shiite perspective, but from the Sunni perspective, you cannot talk about the companions of the Prophet in the same way that you speak about people today. The assumptions about how their community worked, about what motivated them, about their decisions are not the same. Another important principle is a principle of anachronism. Anachronism. An anachronism is something that is out of place in time. It is out of place in time. So, for example, if I said, I'm in England, so I'll use Robin Hood as an example. Robin Hood, I find a text where Robin Hood is using a musket. This obviously is not a real, this is a made-up story because Robin Hood, at least to the extent that we know who this person was and when he lived before the widespread use of gunpowder and the development of muskets. So this, if I see a story where verily, Robin Hood did raise his musket and shoot and accidentally shot Little John in the leg, okay? This text is made up because Robin Hood did not have a musket. This is an anachronism. Now, and this again is an approach that goes back all the way. You can see Greek and Roman historians using this tool to try and pick out things in a historical account that can't be true, that cannot be true. This can't be true because this didn't exist at the time, or this wasn't spoken about at the time. And this is a very important tool that gets revived in, what's wrong? Oh, that gets revived in the Renaissance. It becomes a very important tool in the Western historical critical method. This is very different from the Islamic tradition. Why might this be different? If we come across a report in which the Prophet supposedly says that the Qadariya are the Zoroastrians, the Majus of my community. There is no group called the Qadariya at the time of the Prophet. So if you're someone who is a Western historian who doesn't believe that Muhammad had any knowledge of the future or anything like that, or any access to divine revelation, this is obviously made up because later there's a group called the Qadariya, and it didn't exist at the time of the Prophet. So this was obviously made up later to talk about the Qadariya. Well, if you're a Muslim and you believe that the Prophet could have access to ghaib, to the knowledge of the unseen, that God could inform him about something, then it's distinctly possible that he could predict the future. So this tool doesn't work. It doesn't work when you talk about the Prophet. It can work in other situations, but not when you talk about someone who has access to ghaib. Another important principle, the principle of dissimilarity. This term, I think actually the actual person I've seen using this technical term is Bart Ehrman, University of North Carolina. But this is a principle that even when it's not discussed as a technical term, is very important. And it is the idea that when you're looking at historical source, if something appears that seems to go against the interest of the writer or against the interest of the party to whom the historian belongs, it's probably true. So, why? Because why would the person make it up? Why would the person if the assumption is that people are sort of nasty and we're very cynical about everybody and they're always forging history to make themselves look good and make their party look better, if they include a report that reflects badly on them, well, it's probably accurate, because why would they make it up? And this principle was discussed at length by an early Enlightenment scholar named Jacob Perizonius. I think he was Dutch. As an attempt to convince skeptics at the time, scholars who were very skeptical about our ability to construct the past, to reconstruct history, that he was saying this is actually a tool we can use to determine fact in ancient historical sources, or at least to weed out fiction. Yes?
How are they capable of the fact that some people might create this story to win that reputation? I.e., you're saying that why would they make up something bad against them? Maybe to win you over that I'm not going to. There are things that I may lie about later, but I wouldn't put them in theory.
Yeah, this is something that you would. The question is, well, maybe they're including bad things enough bad things to make you believe they're reliable. This is a very cynical approach. Okay, and if someone's trying to do that, they may succeed. One of the things that historical critical method tends to do is to focus on something called the principle of verisimilitude. So when Western scholars criticize hadiths, oftentimes what they say is, you have a hadith, I was sitting with the Prophet and I remember it was after this battle and we were coming back from this raid. And this is all extraneous information. This is included to give it a sense of reality. So, for example, if I'm telling a story, I said, yesterday I came into the airport and the hallways were so long and I was walking and there was a poster of an Olympic swimmer and there was I looked out in the runway and there was all these airplanes, and then I got to the immigration, to customs, and they asked me questions. None of that information is important. Why did I do that? Because life is more interesting when we include details and stories. But you could also say he was including that just to create the sense of reality. When a writer describes how they feel in a fictional account or in recollection when they're writing their autobiography, when they talk about where they lived and what the room was like that they lived in. Why are they doing this? They're trying to recreate something for you. So the interesting thing, and this really gets into this question of what I'll talk about now, default skepticism. There's no reason why providing detail should be an indication that I'm trying to mislead you. I'm simply trying to recreate something for you. Or maybe jog my own memory to relive a moment in the past. But a more cynical approach is, no, you're trying to, this is created to, this is included to create an image of verisimilitude. Okay, or create verisimilitude. And I think these three important critical tools in historical critical method, they are accompanied by important themes in approach. One of them is a default skepticism and doubt towards texts. This is very important. What does critical mean? What does the word critical mean? When you read historians like Lord Acton talking about what a historian does, a historian is critical. It means when he or she comes across a source, he does not take it at face value. He inquires as to what really happened, what's really going on behind the source. The assumption is that a report about the past needs to be investigated. Is it correct? Now, it's very important. Muslim scholars are also skeptical of reports. They're also skeptical of reports. But there's degrees of skepticism. When you, and if when Muslim scholars present hadiths, and this is something that's somewhat controversial, some people might disagree with me. In general, Muslim scholars would say that you can't attribute something to the Prophet. You cannot attribute something to the Prophet without providing some evidence for it. But actually, in reality, when you look at how hadiths are used in law, or especially in preaching, or in Sufism, or in ethics, or just in daily life, we almost never inquire as to the authenticity of these reports. And someone cites it's in Sunan Ibn Majah or Sunan Tirmidhi. Sunan Ibn Majah is full, up to a quarter of it is unreliable hadiths. Tirmidhi has many, many weak hadiths in it that Tirmidhi himself says this is a weak hadith, this is an unreliable hadith. He himself acknowledges this. And nobody goes and looks that up. Now, I don't mean to say that people who in the West are critical and Muslims are not critical. People are critical about different things. Every day when you go to school in the morning and you pick up the bus schedule, you don't say, is this accurate? Where did this come from? Who wrote this? I need to research this. It's a bus schedule, for God's sake, and it's put out by the municipal authority or something, and they have no reason to lie. Now, there could be, conceivably, some culture that has inured itself to extreme skepticism towards municipal bus schedules. And they will not pick up a municipal bus schedule and look at it without verifying this information. And different cultures are going to, at different times, are going to place different value on affirmation or investigation of the truth of a certain kind of source. And for Muslims, right? If you go to Egypt or you go to Delhi and you walk into a mosque and someone, the khatib gets up and gives a khutbah and tells you hadiths, the assumption is that these are things the Prophet said. Okay? And sometimes that might be an accurate assumption. Sometimes it's not an accurate assumption. And you have many instances from Ibn al-Jawzi in the 1100s to Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the present time talking about how they're sitting listening to a khutbah and every single hadith that the khatib uses is forged. Okay? This happens. But the assumption is that this is not the case. And there are many times coming from the United States, I can tell you, Americans are incredibly ignorant of their history. And they'll sit there listening to some member of Congress giving a speech or a president giving a talk or some historian or watching a movie about John Adams or something like that. And there'll be all this utter nonsense, historical nonsense. It's not true, but no one will be skeptical of it because the assumption is that this material is true. Especially if, George Washington was really great and John Adams was wonderful. And no one's going to go and say, well, is this really true? Was he really a good guy? Did he really say this? This is not something that is an area of skepticism to be indulged in. If someone comes up and starts talking about how Muslims are good or Islam is wonderful, then suddenly everyone gets very skeptical. So people have different triggers for skepticism, yes.
But isn't there an underlying assumption that people take authenticity according to who's saying it?
Yes, this is an important, your statement about the author or the issuer of a speech is important. The speaker is important.
Because if they take the hadith from a scholar they don't trust, they will always question that. And they didn't take this.
Who's a scholar? But who's a scholar you don't trust? I mean, do people not trust? I'm just saying, regular Muslim Joe who's not coming to this class. He has no, like Ibn al-Jawzi says, al-alim 'ind al-'amma man sa'ad al-minbar. The scholar, according to the masses, is the guy who gets up on the minbar. What he says is gospel, to mix religious metaphors. So This is important. And by the way, this is not. We're not sitting here and saying Muslims have all these problems. And again, this is the trap we don't want to fall into. That somehow Muslims have this weird, cultish view of their religious tradition. And why don't they just get with the program and understand that, they need to be critical like Western people? Because, I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting there listening to the radio in the United States to, good radio channels like NPR, National Public Radio, and they just say, when they're talking about the Middle East, it's utter nonsense. And you can't, people will get up and no one will even correct gross errors that are made. Like, I just remember the Muslim Brotherhood assassinated Sadat. This is one. I was sitting there listening to this, trying to call in, and but this is nonsense. This is not accurate. Why is there 3 people on the panel who are all supposed to be experts in the Middle East? No one said this is not accurate. Because it's just not something that people care about. Okay. So the approach of the Western historical critical method is that when you're talking about the past, you are automatically skeptical. And again, I want to stress, not everything about the past. Certain things. When you're talking about religious traditions, when you're talking about orthodoxies, when you're talking about other traditions, when you're talking about your own things that are important to you, to your polity, to your identity, you're going to be less skeptical. You had a question?
So doesn't skepticism apply to other historians?
To what?
To other historians.
Non-Western historians, you mean? I'll get to this. This is an important difference because when you look at when a Muslim scholar is studying Hadith, for example, or studying history. I'll speak mostly about Hadith. When a Hadith critic is looking at the past, and I think there's a very good something like Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a very good example. The Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal contains many weak hadiths. There's a debate about whether or not it contains weak hadiths or weak and forged hadiths. And Hanbalis have debated this amongst themselves, and non-Hanbalis have debated this amongst themselves. I think personally that there's good evidence that there's forged hadiths in the Musnad. But other scholars, Imam Suyuti, Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi, Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi says everything in the Musnad has an asl, has some basis from the Prophet. Suyuti says everything in it is maqbool. It's accepted in some way or another. Whether in law or in ethics or in something, it's accepted. So anytime somebody comes to you with a hadith from Musnad Ahmad, in theory, according to these scholars, this is true in some way. This hadith is true in some way. And you'll see, many times, I don't need to explain this to you because you're Muslims and you've come across this, how many times you see a sign in the masjid or something where it gives you a hadith and it just says Musnad Ahmad. It doesn't explain where it comes from. And the assumption is that it's accurate. Because I think for Muslim scholars in the past and today, if the default assumption with an attribution to the Prophet ﷺ is that it's authentic and that it should move you in some way. If it says, you see a hadith that says, O believers, go and sell your houses and give all the money to the nearest stranger. I'm probably going to investigate that before I decide to sell my house and give the money to the nearest stranger. I think this would be good, approach to life. If it says, you should be kind to your mother next time you see her, okay, I already know I have to be good to my mother. This is established in the religion. So is it really going to, am I going to be very skeptical about this or critical? No. But in theory, if we really were to, I think, try to live the ethos of how we should, as Muslims, think about hadiths, which is you don't lie about the Prophet of God. You cannot lie about the Prophet of God. We should be very skeptical about any time we attribute something to him. So Muslim scholars, sometimes they can be very critical, but the default assumption, I think in general, is that attributions, all things being equal, attributions to the Prophet are believed. And people can be free to disagree with me and we can discuss it. Okay. Another very important point, suspicion of orthodox narratives. That orthodoxy is suspicious. The official narrative of religion deserves to be doubted and is probably not true. And we have to think about why this is. Why does the Western scholars writing about religion in the late 1700s, or about the Bible in the 1800s, or about Christianity in the 20th century, why did they have this assumption that orthodoxies are constructed? They are built. They are not the original representations of the religion. Why do they have this suspicion? Because this is what they discovered about Christianity. And we can go, I would love to go into the history of how this discovery is made and built on. But they discover that, or partially through reconstruction of early texts, partially through a kind of reimagination of what they think Jesus originally taught versus what the religion became, partially through the discovery of new texts, they conclude that what becomes Orthodox Christianity, either Catholic or Protestant, or sort of proto-Orthodoxy, which becomes Catholicism in the 400s and 500s of the Common Era, that this is a later development, and that there was something else before it that was different. And at least if you think about, if you have this obsession with origins, if you believe that originally what people understood as the religion was the true version, as this fellow who did this movie about Islam believes, apparently. Having not seen the movie, I can't be too specific or too critical. For all I know, it's a wonderful movie. The assumption that the original version is the true version, this is also not necessarily correct. I mean, this is not, there's no reason why that's true, necessarily. If you believe that a religion is defined by a body, like the church, or by the ummah as a whole, as time goes on, it constantly speaks and defines a religion for itself, then the original version is not necessarily the correct one. If it changed, those changes are not necessarily illegitimate. But it's this belief that Orthodox narratives, orthodoxies are constructed, and that they are not the original, correct, true message brought by either a historical figure or a prophetic figure. This is also an important theme in historical critical method. Finally, and I've gone probably on way too long about this, but the belief that scholarly investigation can uncover this true history. That by using our minds, using our critical faculties, applying this method, we can actually uncover the truth of the past. And if we can't uncover it, then we'll come and say, you know what, we can't figure this out, but we certainly know what you think, what the Orthodox narrative is wrong, what you've been told is wrong. We can't necessarily tell you what's right, but we know that what you've been told is incorrect. And if we're feeling optimistic, we can go back and uncover the real origins of something. And then you have lots of Discovery Channel documentaries coming out of this belief. Yes?
You say that suspicion of Orthodox narrative is perhaps similar to the way, like, perhaps Salafi schools also look at our own history?
How, is this similar to the way Salafis think about? I think that there is a similarity, but it's not structurally determined. It's a similarity that's just coincidence. So Salafis would look at, let's say, the way that Islam is understood in the year 1400 in Damascus, with madhabs, rigid people following certain schools of law, like a guild, Sufi practices and visiting graves of saints is very important religious practice. They're engaging in speculative theology, and this is important to them too. They would say these are all constructions that are not originally part of their religion, as understood by the Prophet and the companions. But they wouldn't, I don't think that they would automatically look at any expression of religion and assume it's illegitimate or assume it's constructed and it has to be, some origin has to be determined. They're concerned only with Islamic origins, and if they didn't feel that some practice was illegitimate or was imported or lacked roots in the early period, they wouldn't be skeptical of it. And there's lots of orthodoxies, for example, that that Salafis completely buy into. The idea of the rightly guided caliphs. The idea of the Salaf, the idea of the Salaf is an orthodoxy. The idea that somehow the early Islamic period deserves to be followed and is more correct or rightly guided than what happens later. This is an arbitrary distinction. I'm not trying to say it's an incorrect distinction. What I'm trying to say is that you don't walk into a room and knowing nothing about Islam and understand automatically that the first 3 generations of Muslims are different than everyone else. This is something that you buy into as an orthodoxy. Does that answer your question? Let's talk about Orientalism. Finally, at long last. Let's speak about basically Western scholars start studying Islam really seriously in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The Quran gets translated into Latin, really bad translation in 1142 by Robert of Ketton. It's a very difficult to understand. It's translated into French in the 1600s, into English in the 1700s. It's really, I think, in the 1700s that you start getting Western scholars who have a very good understanding of Islam. Before that, I mean, they really do not understand anything about the Quran. They don't understand anything about the Prophet ﷺ. They don't understand anything about Islamic law. They basically, it's essentially polemics. It's just anything bad you can say about the Prophet or about Islam, you'll find it in books, and it just has no relation to reality. You know, the Prophet started out as a cardinal in Rome, and he realized that he wasn't going to become a senior cardinal, so he goes to the desert and he starts his new religion. I mean, stuff that is just really distant from reality, even if you're not Muslim. What happens in the 1700s, you start getting translations of sort of general Islamic histories like the Tarikh of Abu al-Fida. Gets translated into Latin. You have good Quran translations. And by the late 1700s, you have scholars like Edward Gibbon, the famous British historian of the Roman Empire who died in 1794. His section in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire on Islam is excellent. I mean, it's better than a lot of stuff that's written today. I was reading it, I was just stunned at how much this fellow knew. He knows about, the different Hadith collections. He knows that there's Sahih al-Bukhari. He knows that there's Naskh, there's abrogation. He knows about the Prophet's wives. He knows about the different Hadiths that talk about the rewards that await people in heaven. He knows a tremendous amount. And this is a qualitative difference between his work and 100 years earlier. I mean, he's not Muslim. He doesn't believe in the Prophet's message. He believes the Prophet's ultimately an imposter. But it's really, you start seeing really an influx of good knowledge and awareness about Islam. And in the 1800s, even more. Now, Western Europeans start really learning about the Muslim world through 3 main routes. 2 of them are directly related to colonialism. In fact, you could say 4 main routes, really. One is the British East India Company's attempt to understand Islamic law, Mughal court records, Indian history, because they are now ruling by 1815, 1816. The majority of the subcontinent is actually being administered by British authorities. They are administering Sharia courts using Anglo-Mohammedan law. They have to translate books of Islamic law. By the way, they're doing exactly the same thing with non-Islamic religious traditions in India as well. Another way is the European study of the Ottoman Empire, because of the European diplomatic efforts to understand, infiltrate, deal with Ottoman power in the Mediterranean world in the 1800s especially. Another way one could say is actually the Dutch study of Islam in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia really becomes a giant coffee plantation for the Dutch, rubber and coffee. And there's a tremendous study of Islamic law as understood in what's now Malaysia and Indonesia by the Dutch. The last route, which is the one we'll be talking about specifically because it deals with things like Hadith and the Quran, early Islamic history, is an extension of biblical studies. Western study of Islamic theology and Hadith is a direct extension of this study of the Bible. The earliest figures in the Orientalist tradition in Europe are German scholars like Julius Wellhausen, who write very important books about the study of the historical critical study of the Bible, and then they say, hey, if I really want to understand the lifestyle of the tribes of Israel, what better way than to go and look at Bedouins nowadays in the late 1800s and see how they're living? And then they start studying Arabs, and they start studying the Arabic tradition. They start studying the Islamic tradition, and their study of Hadith and the Quran is just all it is a transposition of the historical critical study of the Bible onto the Islamic tradition. The assumption is we did this with the Bible, the Christian tradition. Now let's just take it and apply it to the Islamic tradition, which they assume will yield exactly the same results. William Muir is a great example of a Indian or a British East India Company functionary in South Asia. He was a major, actually a very important person in the East India Company in the mid 19th century. He was actually in the Agra fort during the rebellion of 1857. And he was sort of sending intelligence reports. He was a very important person in the East India Company and then in the post-1857 administration. But he's also one of the most important historians of early Islam. He writes a very influential study of the life of the Prophet. And in it you see some themes that will repeat themselves over and over again in the Western study of Hadith. That Hadiths are made up. They're made up to glorify the Prophet. They're made up to promote certain religious agendas, orthodox religious agendas. And a very important point he makes is that Muslims only look at the transmission of hadiths. They don't look at the contents of the hadiths when they're criticizing them to see if they're authentic or not. And that's why they don't see that there's all these anachronisms. They don't see that the hadiths say things that are plainly crazy and scientifically inaccurate. From his perspective. It's important to say that. Another, and I think maybe the most important person in the Western study of Islam and of Hadith is Ignaz Goldziher, who's a Jewish Hungarian, or a Hungarian Jew at the time is probably the better way to identify him. And he actually goes and studies in Al-Azhar. This is a picture of Azhar in the 1920s, the Azhar courtyard. He goes and studies in Al-Azhar, and he knows obviously Hebrew very well, and he comes out of the German academic tradition, so very well versed in Latin and Greek and Hebrew and Syriac, everything, and he knows Arabic very well. He goes and he studies in Al-Azhar, and you can see this in his work, actually. He's sort of the first case of a Western scholar who goes, benefits from Muslim scholars, comes back and doesn't give them credit, which is, I have to say, I give them credit. If I'm going to say one good thing about myself today, I will say that I give credit where it's due, and I freely admit that anything I've accomplished in my work is completely due to my teachers in Egypt and in other countries. And I feel like I'm a translator of their work more than an independent scholar. And you see things in Goldziher's work that I haven't seen written anywhere. I've not seen them in any written Islamic book, but they're like Azhar traditions. They're, that's ijma' al-rukn al-rakin yastanidu ilayhi ad-din. that ijma is the firm column on which the religion rests. And he says in one of his books that ijma is the bedrock on which the Church of Islam is founded. I feel like this is something he heard and kind of translated. That's just my opinion. I have no proof for that. Anyway, his work on early Islam is amongst the best. I mean, he really knows what he's talking about. Nowadays, you see a lot of people writing about early Islam who have no idea what they're talking about, and have nasty agendas or something. But he had his biases, but he was a very good scholar, very thorough. What his argument was, again, the assumption is that orthodoxy is construction, hadiths are made up, and his argument is that hadiths don't tell us about the Prophet's life. They are a reflection of the community's will, the Muslim community's will, and what the history they want to construct for themselves. How does he know this? Because of anachronism. So if you have hadiths that talk about, there will come a time when, there will be black banners that will come from the east, from Khorasan, and you should join this army because this is the army of the Mahdi. He said, well, this is clearly made up during the Abbasid revolution because the Abbasids had black banners and they were based in Khorasan, and this they made up as propaganda to get people to join their causes. If you find a hadith that says that Sa'id man junnib al-fitan, that the happy person is the one who doesn't get involved in any kind of civil strife, he doesn't get involved in politics, well, this is clearly concocted by Muslims during the Abbasid period when they're trying to basically get everybody to calm down and not get involved in political strife anymore. Or if you find a hadith that says that Ali is to me what Aaron was to Moses, well, this was clearly made up by Shiites in their attempt to convince others that Ali should be, and the family of the Prophet should lead. And another hadith that says that, Muawiyah it's as if he was, or another example that, the Prophet inquired after Muawiyah and he wasn't there, and then he came later and he said, I was sitting beneath the throne of God. Okay, this is clearly made up by pro-Umayyad forces to legitimize the figure of Muawiyah. So he looks at, if you, in theory, the Prophet could have said all these things. If you believe the Prophet knows the future, he could have said all this, and this could all be completely accurate. But because the assumption is that he doesn't know, because the assumption is that people are making this up to construct an orthodoxy, determining what interests these various hadiths serve tells you when they were made up and by whom. Is that clear? This is Goldzaher's argument. So there's hadiths that are made up to shore up Umayyad legitimacy, and that's where you get a lot of the political hadiths. Law, hadiths of law, Goldzaher says, were made up during the Abbasid period, from the mid-700s to the mid-800s, because the Abbasids decided that they wanted to rule sort of with this position of Islamic legitimacy as people who are going to bring back the Sunnah of the Prophet. And they have to figure out how to provide some Islam for people to follow. And they just make up, they support hadith scholars, and these hadith scholars just make up all these hadiths to create a legal code. The people of Ra'i, the sort of the Hanafi school more, he says, they just took the existing provincial laws and made them Islamic. He says that they at least were creative but not dishonest. The hadith scholars were dishonest because they attributed all this stuff to the Prophet. So kind of the general bodies of hadith that we find in hadith books that are used in fiqh and theology were created, in his opinion, during the early Abbasid period. You had a question?
Sorry, it was just a quick question about regards to when these hadiths pop up. Say, for example, the hadith about the black banner. It was never heard during the times of the Umayyads, and Sani appeared during the Abbasids. We could assume that it was for all sure. Is there one way of looking at it? When these hadiths pop up?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak about that right now, because you have to unless you happen to have lived throughout the Abbasid and Umayyad period, which I doubt you did, unless you're an immortal and we're in Highlander or something like that. Which is no one even watches these movies anymore. Anyone ever? Yeah, I used to love these movies when I was a kid. So the point is, we don't know that. How do you figure out if when a hadith popped up? And that's where we get to the next figure, which is Joseph Schacht, who's a German scholar. He's a very interesting figure. He's a German scholar, but he leaves Germany, I think right before World War II. Not very enamored with the direction in which his country was going. And he moved to England and eventually to the United States. And he is a very, whereas Goldziher is really looking at the metin of the hadith, the content of the hadith, to tell you when it's made up. What agenda is this hadith advancing? That tells you when it was made up. For Schacht, he looks at the isnad as well. So, well, yes, we already saw you. Thank you. Okay, here's, oh, look, you even have a green line that has been preserved for you. Wonderful. So this is, Schacht looks at the isnad. And what he says is, he mostly relied on the 6 books. He relied on the of a Shafi'i. Shafi'i's sort of compiled writings by his student Rabi' bin Sulaiman al-Muradi. And he looks at the hadiths dealing with legal issues. And what he says is, if we collect the different narrations of a hadith, what we find is that the prophet, it's attributed to a prophet, then a companion, then a successor, and then let's say at some point you get this, what he calls the common link. And if you look at all the isnads, you kind of create an isnad tree, what you see is that it's after this common link that it really spreads out. So what he says is, our assumption is that this common link is the person who actually originated this hadith. They made it up, they attribute it to the prophet. Because if it had existed earlier, it would have been transmitted more widely. We would have all these other, isnads going out from the companion, from the successor. So what Schacht also does is this is a way you can figure out when this appeared. It appeared with this figure, this common link. What he finds is, if you look, let's say, at the Muwatta of Malik, Imam Malik died 179, 795, 796. You find a hadith, or a report, that is attributed to a successor, someone like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, died around 93 Hijri, the son-in-law of Abu Hurairah. And then you look in the of a Shafi'i. Shafi'i is Malik's student, died 820 of the Common Era. And you find this same report, this time it's attributed to a companion. Let's say it's attributed to Abu Hurairah. And then you look in Sahih al-Bukhari. Bukhari is 2 people away from Shafi'i. 2 people away from Malik, or actually sometimes 1 person away from Malik, often 1 person. And you find the same hadith, and it's attributed to the Prophet. So what Schacht says is that this is back growth of the isnad. The isnad is growing backwards as time goes on. And what he says is, in the early Islamic period, the time of the companions, the time of the successors, between let's say the beginning of the Second Civil War in 680 and the late 700s, that Islamic law is actually local law. Islam is actually these different local schools, Medina, of Kufa, of Basra. Everybody has there's no notion that Sunnah of the Prophet is something that unifies them all. They just have their local schools, the Kufans and the Basrans and the Medinans. Now what happens is, they're all competing with each other. The Kufan says, I think the correct position on drinking Nabid is this. And the Basran says, I think it's that. How do they beat each other over the head with evidence? What evidence are they going to find? Well, a successor says this. Sa'id al-Musayyib says this. Support me. And then the Basran says, oh yeah? Well, look what I have. It's actually a companion in my book who says this. And then eventually, his argument is that Imam Shafi'i comes along in the late 700s and makes the Prophet Muhammad the source that everybody has to go to. He's sort of the ultimate trump card is the Prophet. And his argument is that since, if you look at the 6 books, these are the vast majority of their contents are hadiths from the Prophet that go back to the Prophet. They must originate after the time of the Shafi'i in the late 700s. So it's really in the late 700s to the early 800s that the world of hadith that Sunni Muslims know and love is created. It's created as a back projection of what was originally actually local schools of law, opinions of successors, that gets pushed back first to the companions and then to the Prophet. So his argument is that if you come across if you see something attributed to a successor, it is more historically accurate and earlier than something that's attributed to a companion, and more historically accurate and earlier than something attributed to the Prophet. Is this clear? Have I lost anybody? Yes.
Looking at early Islam, we understand that Islam spread quite rapidly around the world. We went to India, went to North Africa, etc., etc. And therefore, many of the companions even as far as, for example, Cyprus. Isn't it perfectly conceivable? Also, sometimes certain companions had ijazah and ijazah. So for certain hadiths, it was transmitted to them, but it wouldn't be for the lay people. For example, which Abu Huraira, I'm paraphrasing here, probably correct me better, is I have 2 pots of knowledge. If I was to reveal one pot, I reveal one pot, another pot, if I reveal, you chop off my head. That's just a paraphrasing thing. So isn't it conceivable that hadiths that came centuries later were probably around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but they were given to certain people?
That's a very good point. That these are locally limited. Okay, that's an important point, which will be brought to bear on Shacht. Because Shacht's, an important assumption here, is very important, is the idea of an argument e silentio, or out of silence. I think I wrote that down somewhere. It's not on this slide. It should be. E silentio. Sometimes you can get a little pen, and I will write in terrible handwriting. My students love this when I do it. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch. I don't know if you have those in England. Argument from silence. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Or as former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is actually correct from an Islamic perspective. Donald Rumsfeld, not good ideas, but sometimes pearls of wisdom. My wife always gets angry when I say that. But the argument is, if you don't have it, if in fact Malik is this Muslim scholar, he should want to create the strongest argument possible for his position. If he only includes a successor opinion in his book, and not a prophetic hadith of the same content, it must mean that the prophetic hadith didn't exist, because if it did, he would have included it. That's the argument e silencio. As you've said, there are numerous reasons why this might not be there. This is something that is it's a criticism of his work, a good criticism. But that's the argument. This is absolutely core for his argument. Because the backgrowth of isnads is based on the idea that originally it was not a prophetic hadith. There was no prophetic hadith. And that it gets pushed back farther and farther to more and more powerful sources of legitimacy until it ends up with the ultimate source of legitimacy, which is the Prophet. Now, of importance...
We'll stop the questions, because I think, like with this question, you'll be answered later.
Yeah.
How long will join will take?
I'm just going to be very quick.
That's fine. Then we'll
Very
take a
quick.
break after translation.
So, Joinbo, G.H.A. Joinbo is a Dutch scholar who died about a year and a half ago. He's a very interesting fellow. His family, actually, the Joinbo family was a merchant family that was involved in Dutch East India Company and Dutch colonial activities in Southeast Asia. And some of his relatives, the previous generation and the previous generation, were leading scholars of Islam in Southeast Asia. So he comes from a family, really, of that proves both, sort of the Orientalist, sort of an Orientalist tradition of studying Islam, but it's also linked to colonial activities. So very important. So he did a tremendous number of studies of Hadith, and he really builds on Shach's methods, and kind of, yes, we saw you already, and you. Here we go. So here he really kind of elaborates Shach's methods more and creates a new jargon for discussing them. So what his argument is, again, the common link is here we go. The common link is the person who makes up the Hadith. His argument is Muslims love Hadith. They're always talking about Hadiths. They're always talking about how you should listen to the Prophet. They're always talking about how many gazillions of people went and attended the Hadith circles of Sufyan ibn Uyayna or Shu'b ibn al-Hajjaj in Basra. Hundreds and thousands of people there attending these lessons, hearing Hadiths. If really this was happening, you'd have dozens of people transmitting these Hadiths. If you don't have them, then it means these Hadiths must not have been transmitted. His argument is that if you go back and you construct isnad trees based on Hadith collections, those moments of contact, of connection, that are testified to or established by numerous transmissions from that source, those are historically reliable moments of transmission. You can say this happened. The Hadith existed. This person actually said this. If you don't have these numerous transmissions from a supposed source, since Muslims are obsessed with Hadith and they love attending these sessions and listening and transmitting, if it doesn't happen, then it must not have happened. The Hadith didn't exist. So, where are all the people from this companion? Where are all the people who are supposedly transmitting this from the successor? They didn't exist. The Hadith wasn't around. This guy made it up. How do we know that? Because we have these other sources. And he talks about partial common links who are figures who transmit the material from that original source. But if we look at Hadith collections, let's say Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan of Abu Dawood, we find there's other material as well. We see, let's say, in the Mu'jam of At-Tabarani, Mu'jam al-Kabir of At-Tabarani died 360, 971. Abul Qasim At-Tabarani from Isfahan, originally from Tiberias on the Galilee Sea, moves to Isfahan for 60 years and learns 3 words of Persian. Just enough to order out. So he said, he didn't know very much Persian. This is a mark of pride because he never really got involved in non-Arabic things. He's enough to say hello and things like that. So you find an isnad in, let's say, Tabarani's. It doesn't go by this route, via this common link. How do we explain this? Now, according to Yoinbol's method and Shach's method, is this a historically reliable transmission? Does anyone have an answer for that?
No.
Why not?
You don't have the numerous transmissions.
Exactly. This is just made up because if it were real, you'd have all these people coming out of this transmitter and this transmitter. So this guy made it up. Why did he make it up? He wants his own isnad. He wants a shorter isnad. Or he wants to help in this great conspiracy to make this hadith seem more reliable. He calls this a dive isnad that kind of dives in around the side. And Sometimes you'll have a hadith that doesn't have a common link. It's just a bunch of single strands. He calls those spiders. And those for him are not, you can't establish them as existing at any time, basically, until the collection in which they're found. Now, a very important position of Yoinbol. Okay. Is that, and it's implicit in Schacht, it's explicit in Yoinbol, is that, in effect, all hadiths are made up. I mean, you know, you can, if this is your criteria, if these are your criteria for determining when a hadith enters circulation, that it happens with a common link. And if the common link is always someone who's, let's say, a successor or beyond. For Yoinbol, he says that these people usually exist in the early, 700 to 720, 700 to 730 of the Common Era. This is when hadiths are made up. There are no reliably authentic hadiths of the Prophet. And he has an article on the famous hadith of Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar. Whoever lies about me or misrepresents me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire. He has an article on this in which he shows, according to his methodology, that it cannot be established as going back to the Prophet. So if this hadith, which is for Muslims the most authentic hadith, between 60 and 100 companions transmit it. Tabarani has a whole book on the people who transmit this hadith. If this is not reliable, then nothing is. There is no reliably establishable hadith of the Prophet. So what you have, what the hadith tradition is a gigantic conspiracy. Muir had been critical. He says, he looks at Bukhari and he says a third to a half of this book is nonsense. But the rest is, the Prophet had to say something. And it's generally reliable. With Goldzahir, you have skepticism. You have a hadith, if it seems to support some agenda, you take it out as something made up later. But this idea implicit in Schacht, explicit in Yoinbol, is that nothing in the hadith tradition is really representative of something the Prophet actually said. Now, I told Mizan this. I said, I think I'm not giving you your whatever equivalent, metaphorical equivalent of money's worth, because this is all in my book. So I feel really bad. You can read this in the book, but I hope it benefits you, which is good. So this study of the hadith tradition by scholars like Goldzahir, Muir, Schacht, does not go uncontested. It doesn't go uncontested in the Western Academy. It doesn't go uncontested by Muslim scholars writing in English or writing against some of these critics. And what you see is that there's, in the second half of the 20th century, you find a number of scholars, some of them of Middle Eastern origin, some of them Muslims, some of them Christians. People like Nabia Abbott. I've been told her original name was Nabiha Aboud. I don't know if this is accurate. The person who told me this is generally reliable, but sometimes is not, like all of us, like myself included. So Nabia Abbott was originally, she's an Iraqi Christian, and she moved to the United States, and she eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago Oriental Institute has a collection of early Arabic papyri, and also not just papyri, but paper copies of segments of the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal from the 800s of the Common Era. This is very important, by the way, and actually, I'm going to be jumping ahead of myself. It's a second item here. I will shut up and follow my own instructions. Abbott, and I think I don't want to sort of assign intentions to her that she might not have had, but I get the sense from her work that she was standing up for a tradition that she felt was not being given its due credit. It was not being taken seriously enough. She wasn't Muslim. I don't think that she was defending Islam as a religion, but she was defending what she felt was a tradition that had not been studied with a seriousness that it deserved, with the seriousness it deserved. So looking at these papyrus fragments, which came from the late 700s of the Common Era, mid to late 700s. So we're talking around the time of Malik and his students. She came to a few conclusions. And I'll just give you some of the explanation she offers for what Goldziher and Schacht and Yoingbo had found. Okay? So no one is disputing that a hadith in the of al-Shafi'i is, the hadith in the Muwatta of Malik is something a successor said. And then in the of al-Shafi'i, it's something the companion says. And then in Sahih Bukhari, it's something the Prophet said. No one's disputing that fact. I'm not trying to say that's the only evidence out there. But how do we explain this? One of the things that Yoingbo talks about is that, you look in Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, or you look at, the number of hadiths attributed to the companion Ibn Abbas, 1,600 hadiths maybe, 1,600 hadiths. And yet you find reports that Ibn Abbas only transmitted 9 hadiths, sometimes. Right? Ibn Abbas was either 9 or 14 years old when the Prophet died. How could he hear all these hadiths? You hear this often with Abu Hurairah. This is, by the way, the worst argument I've ever heard in my life. Anytime everyone gives you this argument, I don't care what you think about hadith, if you believe them or not, but this argument is idiotic. The argument that Abu Hurairah only knew the Prophet for 3 years, so how did he hear, these over 5,000 hadiths? Because he didn't hear them all from the Prophet, obviously, duh. He doesn't say, I heard the Prophet say. It's very rarely do you see Abu Hurairah quoting the Prophet directly. He's hearing it from other companions. And he doesn't quote them, because like normal human beings, we don't go around quoting, for example, I don't go around telling you who told me, who they heard from, who heard from Martin Luther King. I just quote Martin Luther King because that's what normal people do. They don't give their chains of transmission for stuff that's just in their daily life. It's only later on when Muslims become obsessed with isnads and trains of transmission that they start doing that. This is completely normal. So this is I kind of got off topic, but this is important. When you see these, how do you explain the fact that someone says Ibn Abbas only transmits, a small number of hadiths, but then there's thousands of narrations of this hadith that are attributed to him? One of the things that Abbott says is that this is a very important point. Early scholars, and actually Muslim scholars till this day, use the word hadith to indicate 2 different things. And this is an example. People love to say how Arabic is this perfect language that can communicate. Actually, sometimes Arabic is not the best language, or at least the way it's used is not the best way. And sometimes English can be more useful, because there's a difference between traditions and what I call traditions and narrations, between hadith and riwayah. Hadith and riwayah. A hadith, or tradition, we can think about being a general idea of something the Prophet said. To give this earlier example, whoever lies about me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hell. This is something the Prophet said. Now, there's lots of different versions of this. There's some versions that lack certain words, that add certain words. Because there's all these narrations of this one tradition. From 60 companions, 70 companions, 80 companions. Other hadiths maybe from 2 companions, 4 companions. You have lots of different narrations of one tradition. Sometimes the Prophet might have said it more than once, and different companions heard him on different occasions. Muslim scholars, when they speak of hadiths, will generally associate them with a companion. A hadith is something that a specific companion heard the Prophet say. So you'll have instances in which they are talking about the hadith of Ibn Umar, the hadith of Ibn Abbas, and you're saying to yourself, wait a second, this is the same hadith. I mean, it's the same general thing the Prophet said. Why are there different hadiths here? Because hadith is being used to indicate the transmissions of these different companions of one tradition. When someone says that Ahmad ibn Hanbal selected the Musnad from 750,000 hadiths, that doesn't mean that there's 750,000 different things the Prophet said. These are 750,000 different narrations. And if you imagine how these narrations ramify as people sit and study and transmit and spread knowledge, this is not difficult to believe. When they say, how could the very fact that all these things spread in this number means that so much is being made up, obviously. If companions are transmitting 5,000 hadiths at the most, how can you have 750,000 hadiths later on? Some obviously are made up, and Muslim scholars, by the way, had no problem admitting that. That's why they started the science of hadith criticism. They didn't start it because they had free time and didn't have anything to do. They had a problem, which is people were making up hadiths. Shu'bah ibn al-Hajjaj, who died in 160, the famous Basran hadith critic, he said 3/4 of the hadiths I find are made up. The ones that I come across, 3/4 of them are made up. But this multiplication is because you have to remember that they might be talking about narrations of hadiths, not just the actual tradition that the Prophet said. So this is an important distinction that Abbott highlights. Second, technology. You all have paper. You're writing on paper. Isn't that wonderful? Well, some of you are writing on electronic devices, which is even more wonderful. Unless there's an electromagnetic pulse weapon that goes off, in which case you're all toast. Technology is important. Before this wonderful product of wood pulp that's mashed and pressed, and then you get this great thing called paper. Before Muslims had that in the late 700s, late 700s, 790, 780, it starts coming in from Central Asia to places like Baghdad. What are they writing on? Papyrus. Papyrus is very expensive. You take this reed from the Nile River and a few other places, and you cut it into little sheets, and you paste them together. It's kind of sticky, and you put some solution on it to stick it together, and you get a sheet that's yay wide maybe and as long as the reed is, and you paste these together, and you get a long scroll, and that's how basically that's how you write books until around 200, 300 of the Common Era. Book is actually a scroll. The idea of a book that opens like this, a codex, this really starts appearing in around 200 to 300 of the Common Era. But still papyrus or vellum, what's called parchment, treated animal skin. Also, papyrus is expensive, vellum is expensive, parchment is expensive. How many rabbits can I kill? How many goats can I kill? And sheep can I kill? And segments of sheepskin can I get to write a book? This is expensive stuff, people. You can't write a lot. That's why, the Zuhri, Muhammad ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who died 124, 742 of the Common Era, very important transmitter from Medina and Syria. His whole library could fit into one saddlebag. He could carry it in his, this is the reports. Hassan al-Basri, the famous Basran scholar, died in 110, 728 of the Common Era. His ilm, his knowledge was on this scroll, papyrus scroll about 6 inches in diameter. Ahmad ibn Hanbal's library was 12.5 camel loads of books. Scholars like At-Tabari, many, many dozens of camel loads of books. Huge amounts of material. How do we explain this? Ahmad ibn Hanbal, 12.5 camel loads of books. Zuhri, 1 saddlebag. How do we explain this difference? Ahmad ibn Hanbal had paper, people. He had paper. It's cheap, and you can write. And it's also not that thick. If you see, parchment is even if you thin it out, it's still pretty thick. If you see these, like the Mushaf Uthmani in Istanbul or in Tashkent, I mean, these things are like, they're like this big, and they're huge. It's not something you can carry with you. Paper allows you to write stuff down. When someone like a Zuhri or these early scholars in the mid-700s are writing, they're not writing all the versions of a hadith down that they find. They don't have the space. What they're writing is basically notes to jog their memory. That's why they were so careful about making sure that they read their hadiths to people, that people didn't just look at their notes, that some of them buried their material after they died or burned it. Because it's like reading my lecture notes, not these ones. If you read my lecture notes, you will think I'm an utter lunatic. And you will not get the correct idea about what I'm trying to say, because you'll see bizarre language, misspelling, weird scribbles, coffee stains, things like that. Not accurate. When you get paper, you can start writing down all the hadiths you hear, all the narrations of hadiths you hear. Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad, which he selected from his corpus of hadith that he collected, is huge. About 40,000, it depends. Around, I think the best count is about 27,000 narrations, anywhere between a third and a fourth of which are repetitions. You can actually start writing down. I mean, when people say musnads of scholars, the musnad of someone like Qutayb ibn Sa'id, the musnad of Baqi ibn Mukhlad, this is literally their hadith collection, what they collect over their lifetime of collection. And then they might select from this material to put into different books that they would use for different purposes. But you can have people who are actually collecting. I mean, some books, the Mu'jam of a scholar named al-Masarjisi, who died in 360, about 970 of the Common Era. I think I calculated this. It's in my book on Bukhari and Muslim. I think if it were published, it doesn't exist, because only a madman would copy something so big, or someone with a lot of free time. It doesn't exist, it didn't survive. But it would be something like 200 volumes, I think I calculated. It would be 200 volumes in a library today if it were published. Huge collections. Yes?
Isn't it possible also we have to remember the context of the society we're living in? Remember, this is a society early on in Islam where it was very much oral tradition. Therefore, we need books to remember or to refer to. And scholars at that time often memorized things with tremendous amount of memory. Like, for example, Imam Shafi, I've heard could almost memorize a book with one reading. And when they therefore gave that knowledge on with their Ijaza system to some of their students, it's perfectly conceivable.
I mean, people did, it's important to remember that knowledge is primarily oral. Right? These books exist to jog your memory. The Quran in a mushaf is not the Quran. It's just there to jog your memory, basically. But it's also important to remember that once someone like a Zuhri, yes, their knowledge primarily oral. They had written. Zuhri was a big advocate of writing knowledge down, because writing is important. You know, we can talk about how they had great memories, and scholars, Muslim scholars to this day have amazing memories. I was the first person to throw myself at their feet and wish that I could have memories like them. But they also understood that memory fails you. Memory fails you, and you need to have written copies. The Bukhari says this in one of his books, I think, praying behind the reading behind the imam in prayer. He favors written. If someone has written material, he favors this over someone who doesn't have written material, so you can check that. It's very important. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you can't memorize the Musnad. I would be surprised if someone memorized the Musnad word for word. This would surprise me. You can't do that. You have to write it down. And if you do it, you certainly are not going to be able to be reliable. Because how could someone possibly know you're being accurate?
The link for later. I think we're now
Okay.
my last question.
So another important distinction, point made by Abbott, is that this is something that I've ended up studying a lot. Muslim scholars treated different subjects of hadith differently. They were, and they say this very clearly, you have this attributed to Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, his teacher, to other figures from his generation, from the late 700s to the early 800s. If a hadith comes to me dealing with halal and haram, dealing with ahkam, dealing with fara'id, inheritance, dealing with salah, prayer, we are strict about the isnads. If someone brings me a hadith about the virtues of actions, this and such an action will get you such and such a reward in paradise, about adab, manners, about preaching, things that will make people soft in their hearts, then we're not strict about the isnad. They said this very explicitly. That example I gave earlier about a hadith that says, be good to your mother. Why are you going to sit and spend your time criticizing this to see if the Prophet really said this? Because you have to be good to your mother already. If you find a hadith that says you have to divide up your inheritance in this specific way, you better treat that critically, because this is going to affect people's lives. It's going to affect law. So we need to be sensitive to what the subject is that they're looking at. You can't, let's say, look at how a Muslim scholar is dealing with. Ahmed ibn Hanbal has a kitab al-Zuhd, book of asceticism. You see, this book is so much material in it. It's very odd. Stuff about Moses and Jesus and all sorts of sources. It's like, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, he must really have been he really didn't understand how to be critical. Because it is not a serious issue for him. This is not an issue that needs to be treated with the rigor of law, hadiths about law. And much of these, especially if it's not coming from the Prophet, ﷺ, if it's coming from earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus, if it's coming from companions, they just didn't spend that much time criticizing it. Because it's there to benefit you. They didn't think that it was going to alter core areas of the religion. Other scholars, Andrew mentioned Professor Azami. I'm going to reveal my biases. Actually, I would say I'm going to reveal maybe the latent racism that is part of life in the West, and the way that people think about Muslim scholars. When his book on Schacht, his criticism of Schacht, I saw this book and I did not read it. I didn't read it because I thought there's going to be some Muslim scholar who's saying stupid stuff that isn't going to convince anybody, and it's just going to be a pietistic attempt to rebut a Western scholar, and it's not going to convince anybody. I'm not going to waste my time. So when I was writing my book on Hadith, I said, I actually have to look at the book. I have to be thorough. I have to say something about it. Maybe a few lines I'll put in. You're reading this book. This is an excellent book. These are really good arguments. And I ended up including, I think maybe a whole page, which is in a book, a relatively small book, it's a lot. It was an excellent book. I was extremely impressed. And I immediately took this lesson into consideration and rebuked myself for my prejudices and for my assumptions. So it's important that maybe it isn't important, but I will confess my initial approach and I will confess my error. And if Professor Azami ever sees this lecture, he can take this as my praise for his book. He makes a number of important corrections to Schacht's work. One of them is, and this is an excellent point, he doesn't say it in as many words, but it's certainly in the book, which is this hadith tradition is vast. Hadith tradition is vast. Just the 6 books you're talking about this much book. You add Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you're talking this much book. You add a few other books, you're talking about the whole wall lined with books. You add just the printed hadith books of the Sunni tradition, this whole wall easily. Then the whole other wall, then the whole other wall, then the whole room fills up. This is a massive amount of material. All these judgments, all these criticisms are by definition based on a small sampling of that material. So whatever we say about this material, however we look at it, I could come into the room and I could say, I'm going to assume that these things attributed to the Prophet are authentic until proven otherwise. That's one approach. I could come in and say, this is all made up. Maybe there's some accurate stuff in there, but the assumption is this is all made up. Or I could say, I honestly have no idea. I just have no position. The position of the Orientalist tradition really had been, with Schacht and Yoinbel, had been, this is all made up. But based on what? Based on a small amount of information that had been studied, a tiny, tiny fragment. Is that really an accurate way to judge? I mean, this is a very good question. Is that really an accurate way to judge things? You might look at a few traditions and decide that they're made up. But what if they're the exception, not the rule? As I said before, the Prophet existed. We know that. And assuming that he was like other prophets, that he said things and that people cared about what he said, it's not inconceivable that somebody wrote this down or transmitted it. It's not inconceivable that he said something over the 23 years of his life. So, and it's also, if people really cared about his words and deeds, it's not inconceivable that there is quite a bit of material that was recorded from him, transmitted from him. And why should we doubt that there's several books full of material that the Prophet said somewhere? I mean, why should we doubt that? Not everything that's attributed to him should simply be dismissed as automatically made up. Because something out there, he said something out there. The question is, how do we identify it? When Goldziher and Schacht looked at the material they examined, especially with Goldziher, you'll find that he'll give you an example. Let's say Ghiyath bin Ibrahim. Ghiyath bin Ibrahim he gives us an example of someone who forged a hadith for political reasons. He was in the court of the Abbasid Caliph. The Abbasid Caliph liked pigeons or doves, and so he made up a hadith that says there's no gambling or racing animals except something that has a hoof or a wing. I'm just summarizing the hadith. He adds a winged thing in there. So now I'm allowing you to race and raise and gamble pigeons. Now, this material, this hadith, Goldziher says someone made up this hadith to curry favor with the court. But this hadith doesn't exist anywhere. No, this hadith isn't in Bukhari. This story only exists in Muslim books on hadith criticism, where they're giving you an example of somebody who's forging a hadith for political reasons. So, I mean, it's like taking, that's like I have a book of instances in which I've caught students cheating. How do you identify a student cheating? Here's an example. And then someone comes and finds this book and say, look at how much the students were cheating. See this? This is not a good argument, because I'm listing this as an exception. And oftentimes you'll see this, that the material that is being used to criticize the hadith tradition is stuff that Muslim scholars themselves have put forward as being made up. This hadith about Muawiyah being under the throne of God, no one thinks this is authentic hadith that I know of. I mean, this is included in books, but it's either just not described, which is, I think, a fault on the part of Muslim scholars, and it's a fault that numerous Muslim scholars like Al-Dhahabi and Ibn Hajar mentioned centuries ago. They said you can't just list something and not say it's forged, because if you list something and you're quiet, the assumption is that you think it's accurate. But a lot of these hadith, Muslim scholars themselves acknowledge were made up. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean they think it's accurate. It's not in Sahih al-Bukhari. It's not in Sahih Muslim. Another important point that Adami makes is that Shaykhs had relied on a very small number of books. The of a Shafi'i, the 6 books. These are not in any way exhaustive, or even, they don't exhaust even a portion of the material, of the hadith material that existed at the times of their authors, or the material that exists today that's published from that period, or the material that exists today as in manuscript form. So if you're going to make arguments about from silence, e silentio, if you're going to say that this hadith doesn't exist before Shafi'i, with Shafi'i as attributed to the Prophet, therefore Shafi'i, someone made it up in this time period, you better go and search everything. At least everything that's published. At the time of Shaykh, much material was not published. A lot of books like the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq San'ani was not published. It was difficult to look at. Another important point he makes is that there's all sorts of reasons why someone might not transmit or have access to a hadith. The regional issue we discussed earlier. Different companions went to different cities. Ibn Mas'ud went to Kufa. Right? Amr ibn al-As went to Egypt. Ibn Abbas stayed in Mecca. Other scholars went to Medina. Other people went to Yemen. Yes?
Is it true that Shaykh also used, the sampling he used was incorrect in that he used books of fiqh and polemical works of one madhab against another as opposed to books of hadith?
Well, it depends, because the contains polemical works. I mean, the contains books like Ikhtilaf, Malik, and things like that. There's some of Shafi's works with debates with people are included in this book. Does that answer your question?
I think one of the points Anthony made is rather than use books of hadith to examine hadith, use works of fiqh.
Well, for him, the distinction is immaterial, because if you're making a legal argument, that's even more reason why you should be bringing all the hadiths to bear that you could. So if you don't, in this case, then the hadith doesn't exist. Now, later on, if you're talking about, a Hanbali scholar writing a book in the year 1300 or 1600, and he writes a book of fiqh and doesn't have hadith in it, that's because he doesn't want to bother you with that. He's giving you the rules of the Hanbali madhab. If I went and looked at this book and said, look at this, it doesn't have hadith in it. Muslims don't care about hadith. Hadiths are all made up after the year 1600 when this book was written. That would be a very bad argument. Right? So it's possible that in the early period, and this is one of the arguments that Albany makes, which is that sometimes people get in debates and they don't feel the need to give all the evidence they have. This is, again, a common sense instance. We may be having a debate and I give you one hadith as my evidence, and I don't give you 5 others. And what he brings up an excellent quote of a Shafi'i from Shafi'i's Risala, where Shafi'i says, in this book, I'm going to give you. I write down material that I have memorized right now. Some of my books I don't have now. I know I have this hadith in another book with a full isnad, but I only have memorized this broken isnad version, which I'm writing down for you. So this is, sometimes they're away from their books, or they lost a book. So there's all sorts of instances in which someone is not going to be including the best possible evidence or exhaust all the evidence at their disposal. Now, yes?
Just very quickly on the exception versus the rule. when you mentioned that Shu'bah said that 3/4 of the hadith that I come across are forged or not true, how does that reconcile with what Mustafa al-Adami was saying about it being the exception rather than the rule?
I don't think, I'm not trying to say that forgery was the exception. Remember, when you're talking about forgery, this is a society-wide issue. So the stuff that's forged completely doesn't even make it into, let's say, the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. To be in the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, you have to have an isnad. That was the first step in criticizing material. If someone, imagine someone like Shu'bah sitting in Basra, and someone comes up to him and says, you know, I heard the Prophet said that, you know, the best women are women from Basra. And Shu'bah says, who told you this? It's like, the Prophet said it, I heard. Okay, it's a waste of my time. Just leave me alone. This is utter nonsense. You don't even know where this material comes from. That doesn't even get into the discussion. That's the stuff he's talking about. 3/4 of the material. Now he's collected, let's say, a book of hadiths with isnads. I don't think he means that 3/4 of this book are forged. I think he means 3/4 of the stuff floating around in the universe.
But the Orientalists will use that kind of statement of Hajjaj saying, look, 3/4 of the stuff like
Yeah.
to say, oh, well, there you are.
Exactly. So if it's not put in context, it's easy to overestimate or overinterpret what that means. So when someone's saying, no one is doubting, Muslim scholars are not doubting that people made up hadiths for political purposes. Sometimes they include these hadiths in their books. And either they tell you it's made up or they don't say anything, and that's irresponsible. But it doesn't mean that that instance can be taken as representative of Muslims overall, especially because it's being identified as a case in which a scholar forged a hadith and was caught doing it.
Of course, Shu'bah was in Basra as well, which is...
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim hadith in the Abbasid court. I mean, this is an instance where this person was caught doing it. Okay. Let's look now at revisionism. What is revisionism? People say, this is historical revisionism. Revisionism in history is the idea that, the study of history, is the idea that you are reevaluating what has come to be received opinion. You're reevaluating what has come to be received opinion on a topic. It's not in and of itself bad. Maybe the received opinion is nonsense or wrong, and you're revisiting it. The term is often used negatively. Now, this is just historical revisionism. But that's, I think, an inaccurate use of the term, because maybe it's correct to do this. But we'll use the term because it's useful, but we have to remember, I think, not to automatically assume that it's negative. What we're simply talking about is a movement amongst certain scholars to challenge the received opinion amongst Orientalists or amongst Western scholars of Islam about the origins of the religion. So, what this was a call for is its most well-known proponents are scholars like Patricia Crone, Michael Cook, Princeton, who's revised some of his ideas on this issue. People like Martin Hines. Yes?
Hasn't Cook retracted from his position earlier?
Yeah, he doesn't. His position on the Hagarism, he doesn't. As far as I know, I've not heard him say this, but I've heard his students say that he doesn't subscribe to the position he held in the Hagarism book, that it was more like of an experiment, thought experiment.
There's a recent study on one of the Quranic palimpsest manuscripts, which asserts that Cook has even now gone further to assert that the Hadith tradition is plausible, historically plausible.
I don't know about I've read the article, the Sana Find article by Bahnam Sadiki. That's the one you're... Yeah, I don't remember that detail from the article, but the article's very good. what is the argument? The argument is, if you're going to apply the historical critical method, apply it all the way. Because what you'd seen with people like Muir or Goldziher, Schacht, is they are critical of individual hadiths or a genre of hadiths, but they don't question the framework in which this drama is playing out. If the idea, and this goes back to the historical critical method, one of the principles is the principle of dissimilarity. You don't take someone's history from that person. You don't take Islamic history from Muslims, because Muslims are biased. Muslims are going to create a history that shows the religion as they want it to be. When do you accept things? When it makes them look bad. Because why would they write it? It must be true. But the whole framework, we don't have, there's not a Christian monk sitting in Medina at the time of the Prophet who's writing his memoirs about this really interesting time, and there's this guy Muhammad, he's come and he's got this religion, and today he said this and that. We don't have this. Everything we know about the Prophet in terms of details, specifics, is from Muslims. Why should we believe anything they say? If the earliest books of Sirah and Hadith were written in the early years of the 2nd century, 110, 100 Hijri, so 730, 740. If our earliest surviving books come from the late 700s, then this is over a century and a half, in which people could have completely made up the whole history of Islam. So let's if we're gonna follow the rules of the historical critical method, we're gonna take material from people who aren't biased. Let's do that. The argument by people like Corona is that there is nothing that can be reliably attributed to the Prophet. She takes as an example the case, what's called the Constitution of Medina, or the Wathiqat al-Medina, which is the agreement in things like the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, the agreement between the Muslims and the Prophet and the Muslims and the non-Muslim tribes of Medina and the Jewish clans of Medina about being one polity, one ummah. Why had the majority of Western scholars accepted this as authentic? Because it uses the word ummah to talk about Muslims and non-Muslims together. Why would Muslims write that? Because Muslims are always talking about their ummah and how it's only Muslims, the believers. But look, early on, they used the word ummah to mean Christians and Jews together, and pagan Arabs. See, originally Islam was not as it is now. Originally it was this inclusive movement. I'm not saying that. This is the argument. So the fact that it used the word ummah as it does suggests that it's true. What Krona says is, actually, it's not authentic because it uses the word, it talks about the concept of wala, or patronage. So if I have a slave and I sell the slave, I'm entitled to a certain percentage of the slave's estate if the slave dies, even after I've freed him or her. It talks about this issue, but she says the earliest legal discussions we have don't mention this evidence. Don't mention this. Therefore, remember the argument is if it existed, it would have been used. Therefore, it didn't exist. So her argument is, if this one thing that really people believed is authentic isn't authentic, nothing's authentic. Cook even goes so far as to say that if we use the common link method, we see that even this isn't accurate, because let's say you have a certain hadith about a theological idea, and because you believe that orthodoxy is manufactured, you believe that complex theology comes along later, that early on a religion its theology isn't fully formed, that by looking at the metans of certain hadiths, you know they were forged later, let's say at the year 750. I'm just giving this as an example. But the common link would suggest that it's actually earlier, let's say 700. I'm just making this up. Therefore, even the common link doesn't work because we know the Hadith is actually later. And what they proposed is to look at non-Muslim sources. Some of them include this text, Greek text called Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizati, the doctrine of Jacob the newly baptized, which is an anti-Jewish Christian polemic written about 634, so 2 years after the death of the Prophet, that mentions Islam. It says that it mentions it tangentially. It says this person arrives in North Africa and he says, yes, I came from Palestine, and there's this figure in Arabia who claims to be a prophet in the tradition of Moses. They've taken over Palestine. They killed one of the Roman magistrates, and he claims to have the keys to heaven. I think this is in the text. And there's other figures like the Armenian bishop Ceballos writing in the 680s, the Zuknin Chronicle from a monastery in northwest Mesopotamia in the 680s, 660s, 670s. John of Phoenix writing around 687, another monk in Mesopotamia. These are non-Muslims writing about the early Islamic period. So they come up with this argument based on this material that Islam actually was an apocalyptic dispensation of Judaism in which these Arabs in the Hijaz kind of rediscover their Abrahamic heritage, and they have this idea of this apocalyptic movement where they'll go with the Jews and recapture the Abrahamic homeland of Palestine. And that the idea of Muhammad as a leader, as a prophet, and all this stuff is a later development. That's just a very, very basic summary of some of the general revisionist view of early Islamic history. There's many people who have ideas that are even more divergent from the received opinion of early Islamic history than that. Some people saying that the Quran itself, all of Islamic history is really made up after the year 800 of the Common Era, that it's an Abbasid creation. So there's a large menu of options or of choices for different revisionist visions of the early Islamic period. Some of them more extreme than others. What there is, this revisionist wave in the late 70s, especially in the early 80s, but until today, there's scholars writing kind of revisionist versions of Islamic history, including my own professor, Fred Donner, in his last book about the Muhammad and the believers, including things like this, apparently this movie that was made, this documentary, which I haven't seen again, but from what I've read, seems to be fairly revisionist, including scholars like this anonymous or pseudonymous Luxembourg and his writings about the Quran. The idea that the Quran, the whole narrative of the life of the Prophet, the narrative of Islamic origins, is all a creation of at least after 692. At least it's after the end of the Second Civil War. This is the sort of earliest at which time Islam as a religion is created. And before that, it was something else. This is maybe a general summary of the revisionist arguments. Now, some scholars have criticized this. Western scholars, non-Muslim scholars, and some of their arguments, actually one of their main critics is Fred Donner, who himself has a slightly revisionist version, but he's also very critical of people like Krona. And one of the arguments is who runs this conspiracy? I mean, you have basically a Muslim community that after 660 is racked by civil war, several civil wars. Between 660 and 750 is the number of conflicts, internecine conflicts, is very large. defies listing right now. It's spread from West Africa to Sindh, from Central Asia to Yemen, in a time period in which communication, any kind of central state control, is very difficult. How can you possibly have a conspiracy that creates the person of Muhammad? I mean, you have evidence in Hadith collections, in history books. You have evidence of people promoting a pro-Shiite agenda, pro-Sunni agenda, pro-Kharijite agenda, pro-Umayyad agenda, pro-Abbasid agenda, pro-Kufan agenda, pro-Basran agenda, pro-Persian agenda, pro-Arab agenda. All this material is evident. Yet they all agree that there was this Prophet Muhammad, that he lived at a certain time, that he was very important, that his precedent is authoritative in some way or the other. So they're able to, they can't agree on anything. They're fighting with each other, literally. But somehow they all agree to have this conspiracy where they invent this story of the Prophet in the Quran and things like that. And by the way, the Quran doesn't have any evidence of this. There's no, Ali isn't mentioned in the Quran. Abu Bakr is not mentioned in the Quran by name. The Umayyads aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Abbasids aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Basrans aren't mentioned in the Quran. The Kufans aren't mentioned in the Quran. So somehow this document is preserved without, they come together and they decide, we're going to make something up that doesn't have any evidence of being scarred by our conflicts. They get together in a big conference, and although they can't agree on anything, they agree to do this project. This is not utter nonsense. It's impossible, I think. I think it's plainly impossible. In fact, the whole argument of people like Fred Donner for the fact that the Quran is a very early document, it comes from before 692 in his opinion, is that it doesn't bear any of the evidence of these civil wars. The Hadith collections do. Hadith collections, if you look at them, there's plenty of evidence that you would say, this was made up during the civil wars to support one side or the other. The Quran doesn't have that. I'll go down to this. I realize that it's actually better for me to go down to the point number 4, what stories do the non-Muslim sources really tell? Because if we do say, we don't trust Muslims, let's not listen to Muslims about their religion or their history. Let's only look at non-Muslims. If we actually look at what the full picture, the full image that these sources convey, what you see is something that's not that different from what Muslims think. And if I recommend a book by, I think he's a wonderful historian, Robert Hoyland. He's British, but I don't know where he works now, if he's in the UK or at Oxford. I've always wanted to meet him. Very, oh, really? Oh, he's coming to the US too, to Georgetown to give a lecture. I'm very excited. I've really enjoyed his books over the years. In his book, Islam as Others, I think Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, or Seeing Islam as Others See It. I can't remember the exact title. But he's a discussion at the end, which is excellent. He says, let's actually look at just taken together, what do these sources say? If you look at John of Phoenix and the Zucnin Chronicle and Sebeos and Doctrina Jacobi, you get this composite image that there was a person named Muhammad, that he was the Mahdaya, he was the guide, the Syriac word for the guide of the Muslims, that he preached the religion of Abraham, that he taught the Arabs about the one God, he forbade lying and eating carrion, that the Muslims took the sunnah of their prophet really seriously, the law of their prophet really seriously, and punished people who didn't obey it, that they built mosques, houses of worship that tried to face Mecca, that they saw themselves within the tradition of Moses, that this was all happening in the 630s, this is all. This is not that. I mean, you don't get the details. You don't get, the Prophet said this and the Prophet said that. The details of Hadith, but the general narrative seems to be confirmed, and there's nothing there that is unusual for a Muslim. And if there are things in these non-Muslim writings that differ with what Muslims say, or that seem to be denigrating, well, that's not surprising, because one, some of these figures don't have a lot of information about Muslims. Two, they don't like Muslims. They are writing about the group that has taken over their lands and is a scourge of God, bringing a heretical religion. It's interesting, they don't complain. They talk about Muawiyah's rule as being a time of justice and prosperity. They say the Muslims, they don't really care about your religion as long as you pay your taxes. They don't really care what religion you follow. Interestingly, one of their criticisms, I think it's the John of Fenak says this, one of his criticisms is that the Muslims don't persecute Jews enough. They're really upset about this. Because the Byzantine emperor in 632 issued an edict that to forcibly convert all Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Not a lot of people know this. He issued an edict to forcibly convert all the Jews of the Byzantine Empire to Christianity. Why didn't that get carried out? Because of the Muslim conquests. So there's a reason why in a lot of areas, especially Egypt, the population welcomed the Muslim invaders. Why did the Muslim conquerors set up capital in Fustat, it's now Cairo? Why not Alexandria, which is the actual capital? Because they went in with the Byzantine emperor had appointed his own patriarch of Alexandria, not accepted the patriarch who represented the religious beliefs of the people in Egypt at the time. That patriarch was kind of an outlaw, and he basically was, the Muslims were going to install him as a patriarch. And their invasion and occupation, not of Alexandria, but of the area around Cairo, was done with the cooperation of the Christian leadership in that area. And one of the arguments for why they set up their camp there in Fustat was because they wanted to use the monasteries in that area to help them administer the region. Because Muslims, remember, they don't know how to do taxes or anything. They're Bedouins. They don't know how to deal with agricultural tax. So they needed the existing administrative elite of places like Syria and Central Asia and Egypt. So the argument being that really these non-Muslim sources don't tell a story that's dramatically different from the Muslim sources. What about arguments against Schacht and Goldziher and Yoinbol? We already mentioned the defenses put up by people like Adami, but other scholars built on that. Harold Motzky, for example, a German scholar, is now retired. He's not Muslim. He says very clearly, I'm not interested in defending hadiths. I'm not trying to defend the Islamic tradition against critics. But what I'm trying to do is to actually take the evidence seriously and not just judge it without real scholarly investigation. We may conclude that a certain hadith is made up or that a certain set of hadiths are forged. But we shouldn't conclude this without analyzing the evidence closely. And he introduces a method of analysis that he calls isnad co-metin analysis, isnad and metin analysis, which is based on a few assumptions. That the isnads that Muslims include in their books in some way represent real transmissions that occurred, in some way. That the contents of hadiths usually tend to be consistent along the lines of these transmissions. That a certain transmission will include certain detail in the metin, another one will include another detail. And he comes to these conclusions based on his own experience in reading. These are important assumptions of his analysis. And what he does is, if you take into consideration the actual breadth of the Islamic tradition. So instead of just using the 6 books, so Yoinbol basically used a book called Tuhfat al-Ashraf by Jamal ad-Din al-Mizzi, who died 742-1341, a colleague of Dhahabi and Ibn Taymiyyah in Damascus. It's essentially a map of the isnads in the 6 books and a few other small collections. And he uses this to construct the isnad trees that he analyzes. And he might add a few other books like the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. But this is a tiny fragment of all the material, even from that early period. The Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani, the Musannaf of Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, the Jami' of Ibn Wahab, the collections of Tabarani, the collections of Ibn Abi Dunya. Tremendous material. And what Musket does is he actually goes and looks at all this material. He puts in the effort that Muslim scholars put in, at least to follow what they did. And I wrote a review of Yoinbol's book, and I feel bad because he's now dead. He passed away. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But I will say that what I said in the review is he complains about how, why did they think so atomistically about hadith? Why didn't they realize that if they put all these isnad trees together, they'll figure out that this material was forged? Well, where did you get these isnad trees? From their book. I mean, you used a book that is documenting these isnad trees. You're saying they're thinking atomistically and not holistically. But that's like saying, and I mentioned this in the review, that's like saying that a society is unordered and disorganized by using their own phone book to say that. This is a list of everybody who lives in a country, alphabetically with address and phone number. How can you say that they're not? I mean, you're contradicting yourself. The very basis of your argument contradicts your argument. And why didn't they come to your conclusion that this stuff is made up? Because they don't have your assumptions that it's all made up. They don't believe that just because there's not something before a common link that it was made up. Because these comes from assumptions that are specific to one culture, one civilization, one historical approach. So when he looks at his articles and book chapters really focus on specific hadiths, and he especially used the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani. So Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani died 217, I think, 211 or 217, I can't remember exactly. 211. And what is that in Miladi? Like 826? Okay. Yeah, okay. So he looks at this material, and what he says is, if you actually look at this huge breadth, you find that the common link is earlier than that someone like Yoinbol would have thought. It's not a successor or one of the next generation. Sometimes the common links are companions. So you're pushing back a hadith to the late 600s, the time of people who knew the Prophet. And if the argument is that if there's a common link, then the hadith really existed at that time, what you're saying is it existed at the time of the companions of the Prophet, which is not that different than it's not a far stretch of the imagination to say that it comes from the Prophet. I mean, you're basically getting back into the era of what Muslims would say. Now, he doesn't say this for all hadiths. He looks at specific ones. But what he says is, look, this material, some of it really seems to go back to the late 600s of the Common Era. Another thing he does is he looks at the transmissions of specific sources in Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani's Musannaf. He looks at Ibn Jurayj, who died 150. He looks at Ma'mar bin Rashid, who died 153 of the Common Era. He looks at the transmissions of al-Zuhri. And what he sees is that there seems to be real consistency in what Ibn Jurayj transmits, in what Ma'mar bin Rashid transmits. And that they will sometimes transmit material that they don't agree with, that contradicts their opinions on law, So if they're making this stuff up, why are they making stuff up that contradicts them? There's no reason for that. That they'll sometimes transmit things and say, I don't know what this means. It makes no sense to me. I don't know what this word means. I don't know what this ruling means. Why would they make stuff up and then say, I don't know what it means? What he concludes is that people like Ibn Jurayj, Ma'amar ibn Rashid, so we're talking about, the generation, 2 generations from the companions, but they were really, seemed to be reliably transmitting material, which gets you back to their sources in the early 100s Hijri, so the early 700s or the late 600s. And this is, again, you're getting to the time of the companions. Not so different than what a Muslim would say. Now, a Muslim might say that this comes from the Prophet, but you're really pushing back the date of when this material can be established as existing historically from the early 700s to the late 600s, time of the companions.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
By the way, I went to Chicago the year you left.
Oh, you went to Chicago to the university?
Yeah. Muhsin spoke about you to me a lot.
Muhsin? Yeah, Muhsin from Nedwa.
Muhsin, that's right. Yeah. Anyway, I actually did meet Fred Donner, took some classes with him and stuff. It's quite nice. Nevertheless, my question for you is that it's something that I'm working on myself as well. But I want to put it as a question to you, just to see how you think about it. Certainly, the principles that we carry influence the judgment calls that we make, right? So
Yeah.
a capitalist judgment call would be very different from a communist judgment call.
Mm-hmm.
What principle, essentially, do you think the West has got right or wrong that's causing it to make the judgment calls that they're making in relation to the
Yeah.
Hadith tradition? And I say this because I actually did point this out with Patricia in front of Fred Donner, and I made her apologize for this. Because she came, and it was an interesting, although Islamic science is not, I'm more in philosophy. But I just want to say,
Well, what was the? Hang on, I'm curious. What was the thing you got her to apologize for?
it was a number of things. There was about 3 or 4 issues that me and Patricia sort of. She got so upset with me afterwards. She goes, "How dare you do this to me in front of everyone?" But nevertheless, and Fred Donner came up.
But what was the? I'm curious. What was the point?
No, I'll talk about that afterwards because that's very much related to the question that I've just posed to you.
Okay. I mean, the question is, what principles do you think that?
Dr. Brown,
Yes.
sorry. Can we leave that question when Sheikh Akram's here? I think it'd be a good panel discussion and good answer. So if we can preserve that till later.
Fine with me.
Both of your views on it. Is that okay? So I'm sorry, you have to repeat the question, but maybe a
just
bit.
one very second. The reason I asked this question.
Were you here last time for the last session, the beginning?
No, I just.
Well, I talked a lot about where the origins of principles are, and what the origins of principles of historical critical method are, and which of them were right or wrong is another issue we can talk about later. But the principles come out of. I mean, they come out of a. To be very brief, they come out of a rediscovery of Greco-Roman tradition, which is cynical, historically cyclical. There's not this idea that principle of analogy societies are always functioning the same way. That is secular, in effect. It doesn't acknowledge
Ian, please. Let him answer the question and then we'll leave it till later on. Okay, that's
No,
it.
I'm not answering the question. I'm asking another question.
Well, you can only ask one question at a time. You want to know the principles, or do you not want to know the principles? Otherwise, I won't tell them. I already told them.
Right.
A secular vision. If you read Herodotus's histories, he died around 420 BC. He doesn't buy the interference of gods in reality. Sometimes he does, sometimes. But when he talks about the Trojan War, he doubts the whole premise of the Trojan War. People don't fight over women like this. No one's not going to go 10-year war because someone has some. Why didn't they return Helen? Who would fight a 10-year war? And some guy stole another man's wife, and just to give her back. This is nonsense. He says that Helen was never in Troy. So this is very interesting, this idea that, doubts the involvement of the gods, doubts this, what he feels is irrational way people, because people always behave the same way. Principle of analogy. It comes out of the humanist tradition of going back to early textual sources that leads people like Desiderius Erasmus, died 1536, to, in his reconstruction of the original Greek Old Testament, to realize that certain verses, the verse that is the only explicit mentioning of the Trinity in the New Testament, that he realized this is not originally part of the New Testament. That leads them to the Renaissance sentiment that world is getting better, that they are living in an era where new knowledge is being discovered. When you read someone like Louis Leroy he died 1575, he talks about how we're making advances in knowledge that's never made before. They start the willingness to question established truths is absolutely essential from the 1500s until today. The fact that people, in the late 1700s, say that Homer didn't write the Iliad and the Odyssey. There was no person named Homer who wrote both these books. They're overturning a pillar of the Western literary canon. This confidence to overturn truths, established truths. The Protestant Reformation, which destroys control of interpretation of a text. The concomitant political liberalization in places like the Dutch Republic and eventually in England, in Holland in 1600 onward, in England after this English Civil War, and the recension of the censorship laws, or the lapsing of the censorship laws in England in the 1690s, creates freedom to think and express ideas. The discovery of the New World, discovering people who didn't fit into the biblical history of Noah and Adam, people who don't exist in the Aristotelian map of the world. Completely overturns what many of the assumptions that intellectuals in the European tradition had. And you can see this very clearly if you read books like the Essays of Montaigne, who died in 1592. It was a very good example. So these things all go into the basic principles of historical critical method. So to continue this Western revaluation sort of stage in the study of Hadith, these aren't, they're not announcements about when these stages begin. So I wouldn't say, okay, Orientalism's over, Western evaluation time. That's not, these are just the kind of periods, schools of thought that I'm talking about, names that I've given them. So it's important to remember that. One of the most fascinating articles I've read recently was in a recent issue of Dar Islam by Behnam Sadiki and another author whose name escapes me right now, about this Sana'a find. So in 1979, the Great Mosque in Sana'a, someone was fishing around in a crawl space, and there's all these manuscripts because Muslims, like medieval Jews, didn't think you could throw away. I mean, you don't throw paper with writing onto a garbage dump, which is where garbage went. I mean, garbage went to a dump. You can't just throw paper there. You have to do something else with it. You burn it or something. And sometimes they would just stuff it in crawl spaces. And they found this stash of manuscripts, and apparently some of them were very early, fragments of the Quran from the early 700s. And one page was interesting because it's a palimpsest. What that means is something was written and then erased or obscured, and then something else was written on top of it. Because remember, parchment is expensive, and so you reuse it. You can wipe off the ink and reuse it. So there was a palimpsest of Quran writing of the Quran, and using different infrared lights and things like that. A group of German scholars, and this was really since the late 90s, had been announcing this, that they had discovered evidence that suggested that the Quran the Quranic text had developed over time. And I remember in the late, I think it was 1998 or 1999, this article, the Atlantic Monthly, came out, and it had this image of a microscope kind of cutting, or no, a magnifying glass cutting into the Quran. You know, scholars are investigating what the Quran really says. And it's about every 6 or 8 months. You're sort of, okay, it's about time now, and cue the article that comes out in Wall Street Journal. Group of scholars have come across a new manuscript find. Suggests, that Islam might not have always been the way it is. Okay, here we go again. Just like this movie, you're just like, oh, it's just another discovery made. And nothing ever came out. These German scholars weren't ever producing this evidence. And eventually, this two professors did do a study of this. They dated this piece of paper actually to a very early period, between 640, 670 probably. So that's most Ottomanic Quran period and before. And then they looked at the text that had been reconstructed using this ultraviolet light or whatever is used to read these things. And surprise, surprise, it's pretty much the same as other Quranic texts. There are some differences, but the differences are the same as the differences between the different 7 or 10 readings. The differences, if you read this book by Professor Azami, you'll find, and there's a newer edition too, which is very interesting. It's an excellent book. I really recommend it. He talks about the differences between the Ottomanic copies of the Quran. There's slight differences. There's a wow, there's a and or not an and. And do this or just do this. Not a big deal. So the differences are the same as between Uthmanic Masahif, between the existing readings of the Quran, the 7 or 10 widespread and widely accepted versions. And basically that this was all a bunch of, much to do about nothing in a sense. And what's interesting is that they argue that this page, this palimpsest page, is actually a non-Uthmanic Mus'haf page. So this is from one of the Mus'hafs that either predates or survives the purge of the Mus'hafs after Uthman promulgated the Quran around 650. And even this version is not different, really. So it's a bunch of drama and there's no reason. That's the conclusion. All a bunch of noise with no basis. Yes?
There was the undertext, which is pre-Islamic. The overtext, the superior text is Uthmanic.
Yeah, but the undertext is what we're talking about. The stuff that has to be reconstructed through various lights. Okay, I'm pretty much done talking. That was the crux, sadly. But the crux will be in my enlightening comments, inshallah. Yes, you have a question?
I have a question about the Musket approach from matter analysis. In your opinion, does he cover any genuinely new ground with this analysis that's not covered by the previous Hadithin? Or is he really retracing the Hadithin, the Hadith scholars from Islamic history? Or is he just basically retracing their steps in selected examples? Or has he in any way gone, because in some of his writings, he seems to be saying that this is the basis on which we can reconstruct, this and that.
Yeah.
In your study, does he bring anything new to the table in terms of technique?
Well, the problem is that you're talking about two different tables. Okay. Does he bring anything new that the Muslim scholars didn't do? No, but that's not the point. The whole point of this is that if we could just say what Muslim scholars said, then we wouldn't have to have these debates or discussions and all this stuff would be moot. The point is that you can't trust Muslim scholars. You can't trust the Islamic tradition of Hadith authentication. If you could, then this issue would be resolved. So what he's doing is proposing a method for, because it's so painstaking, because it's so difficult, it really works you have to do things one hadith at a time. And for the hadith he's looked at, I think he's proposed that this is a method for reliably dating when you can say a hadith existed. Maybe it pre-existed, but you can say we know that it is in circulation at a certain point. And his method tends to suggest that this point is much earlier than what someone like Yoinbol or Schacht had said before. Now, does it bring anything new to the table from a Muslim perspective? Not really, because the Muslim scholars are doing the same thing. They just have different assumptions. They have their own science of jarh and ta'dil, of investigation of isnads, of authorities they consider to be reliable. And that's the pillars on which their tradition is built. Those pillars don't mean anything necessarily to a non-Muslim scholar. Yes?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Are you planning to conduct any studies in the near future on some of the material evidence we have to complement the Hadith literature, which can be found in the early collections? For example, the epigraphic records, papyri evidence, then we have Sana manuscripts. With all of these material evidences appear to be complementing the Hadith literature and its authenticity, including the chronology, the Hadith chronology, Hijri chronology, based upon all this evidence. Because it appears that the previous scholarship has kind of neglected this side of evidence.
Well, the problem is that when you're dealing with a very small amount of material, I mean, when you say, are you going to investigate things because these corroborate hadiths? Yes, you find an epigraphic, find a rock carving that says, in this year, year 13, of the Hijra, may God have mercy on Fulan, some person.
Omar is mentioned.
Yeah, Omar. But may God have mercy on me, someone carving this rock. Well, earlier, people like Patricia Crona had said that the Hijri dating system was invented much later. No, it's not. Now, at least we know it's the year 13. They're saying this Hijri during the caliphate of Omar ibn al-Khattab. Surprise, surprise. So this corroborates a specific element, feature in the Hadith tradition. But these are particulars, and barring the discovery of a gigantic number of particulars, you will only be bolstering or verifying a small number of particulars. The assumption about the general nature of the religious tradition remains the same for non-Muslims. I would say as a generalization. I know this is a generalization, but I think it's an accurate one. The general assumption is still that orthodoxy develops, that a significant amount of the material attributed to the Prophet is unreliable. And one of those assumptions is not going to disappear. And that's the assumption that he was not a prophet. Okay? You can believe that Muhammad existed. You can believe that we have generally reliable information about the early Islamic calendar, or when things happened, where they were. Maybe we can date material going back to the time of the companions, maybe even to the lifetime of the Prophet. The Quran, we can say, is now historically verified through a number of means as being relatively intact, etc., or that the Muslim version of its history is reliable. But you're still not going to accept that the Prophet Muhammad could know something about the future. So let's take this hadith of the black banners coming from the east. You still think the Prophet, let's have our imaginary non-Muslim Western scholar. He or she is still going to think that this hadith was made up during the Abbasid revolution to support the Abbasids. Because people don't know the future. Now, I've talked about this in one of my books, but I think this is an interesting possibility, which is that, let's say the prophet is not a prophet. Let's say he's some kind of deluded person, but he thinks he's a prophet. Prophets prophesy. It's one of the things they do. So let's say he starts saying things about the future. In time there will be this army that will come from Khorasan, they'll have black banners, etc., etc. If you are the Abbasids and you're based in Khorasan, why not make your main color black and have black banners? Because this would help fit in with scripture. So sometimes history follows prophecy. Sometimes history follows scripture. You can scripturalize history. So an example of this in the book of, I think it's the book of Zechariah, Old Testament book. The book says, "Rejoice, O daughter of Zion, O daughter of Jerusalem. Your king comes unto you, riding a donkey or the foal of a donkey." Now in the New Testament, Jesus enters Jerusalem riding a donkey or on the foal of a donkey. Now, it is not inconceivable that the historical Jesus decided to ride into Jerusalem riding a donkey because this is how it's predicted. Or it's not inconceivable that the people writing the New Testament described his entry in a way that scripturalized it, that made it fit into scripture. There's in the Tang dynasty in China, which came to power, I think, in the 600s. I don't want to. My dating is a bit off. Someone can look that up on their computer. The Tang, Tang dynasty. Anybody tell me when that came to power? Nobody has computers on anymore, or internet, or smartphones. Somebody look it up and tell me. It's an interesting story. There was a popular song at the time about someone named Li, and this person named Li was going to take over. And there was a major family, a powerful family in the kingdom named Li, and eventually people started suspecting him of being this person, and things got so uncomfortable, eventually he did take over. Someone have any, when did the Tang dynasty start? 680? 680? 618, excellent, thank you. So this is looking back in history at this, a historian would say, this story was concocted, this popular song, was concocted later on to try, by the Tang dynasty, to argue that people had been calling for them to take power. But that's actually the opposite. So sometimes people follow prophecy or popular songs. History can be inverted. This is an important thing to consider. So this might be a way in which sometimes someone who acts like a prophet might accurately know the future because the future follows what he said. Yes.
Firstly, to start with the presentation, I wanted to ask something more specific. Recently there's been a discussion about the age of Aisha. And I wanted to ask the question, given the acceptance of the Hadith being authentic, can a Muslim adequately believe that the age of Aisha was 9 when she married without contradiction? Or
what do you mean without contradiction?
To say that there may be another hadith from a different source that may contradict the age, or does the study of the hadith, the entirety, lead to sort of an agnostic position on her age?
You seem agitated about this.
Yes.
What is your agitation? Why are you so uncomfortable?
I'm not so uncomfortable about it, but some people are.
What makes you uncomfortable?
I'm not uncomfortable about it.
What makes...
The age of Aisha is a lot of married process.
Why? What makes you uncomfortable?
In the context of now, and then marrying a young girl,
if I was to point you,
they would consider it a
I think the question is more to do with later sources such as Ibn Hisham and Tabari and Tabaqat ibn Sa'd. They have reports which appear to identify a different age.
Tabari says she was 9 when... Tabari has a very interesting quote. No one ever cites it. Tabari says they signed the marriage, they did the marriage contract when she was 6, but she was young, كانت صغيرة على الجماع. She was too young to have sex, and so they waited, and then they consummated the marriage later. So this is I've looked at all the evidence on these other arguments of how she was older. I don't find it convincing at all. I mean, it's really I understand people why they're making that argument, but I think their arguments are very weak. You know that she shahadat Badr, and that she witnessed the Battle of Badr, and that Ibn Omar wasn't allowed to go to participate in battle until he was 15. So she must be at least 15. But that's like saying that in order to go to a Manchester United game, that's a soccer team here, correct? Okay. What's a London version? Chelsea. Arsenal or something. In order to go to an Arsenal game, you have to fulfill the physical requirements of the athletes in the game, which is utter nonsense because she didn't participate in the battle, obviously.
My question wasn't an ethical question.
No, yeah.
I was asking more from the science of Hadith.
The science of Hadith is that Aisha says, the Prophet consummated the marriage with me when I was 9 years old. That's what the Hadith says. There's an authentic Hadith in Bukhari. And even if you don't want to say that Bukhari is, his book is the most authentic, it's the most explicit data you have on this issue, and everything else is implicit, derived from very tenuous assumptions about culture or something, or practice at the time.
So would you say that anyone would go against the understanding of her being at 9 years old is implicit information rather than...
I think it is, because you have to look at, this is a very interesting issue. Okay, this is a very interesting issue. Non-Muslims, from the life in the community of the Prophet in Medina, from his opponents in Mecca, to John of Damascus, died 749 in his polemics against Islam, to Matthew of Paris in the 1100s, to Voltaire, to Gibbon, to the Chanson de Roland, to anybody who wants to insult the Prophet. They had tons of information. They were looking for anything they could use to insult the Prophet. And his sex life was target numero uno. It's in the Quran, the issue of Zainab and Zayd. I mean, we have document during his own time, people said, you're committing incest because adopted children are like regular children. This is true in Near East, this is true in the Roman Empire, in Roman culture. And the Quran says, no, they're not. This was the biggest, if you look at the instances in which the Zayd-Zainab affair is mentioned by critics of the Prophet, from his lifetime until 1900, you will run out of, check marks on the paper before you count the number of times this story is used by opponents of Islam. They also insult him for marrying Aisha. Why? Because he was so obsessed, he's so lustful. He's such an id-driven creature. I don't believe this, just in case someone is recording this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just quoting the opinion of others. He's such an id-driven creature that he has this fantasy of Aisha, a dream about her, and he wants to marry her. No one ever mentions her age, ever, that I've found, until 1905. The British historian David Margoliouth has a book on the rise of Islam, the Prophet and Islam. And he mentions this, and he says it's an ill-advised union. For how else should we characterize the marriage between a man of 53 and a girl of 9? This is the first I've ever seen that anyone mentions this. Why is that? Why is that until the early 20th century, no one talks about this? When they are making stuff up about the Prophet to insult him, and they don't bring this up. Because they were all marrying underage girls too. I mean, you have to understand, the pre-modern, in fact, even today, peasant societies, to use the Marxist term, societies where you have the vast majority of people live in small agricultural communities, and agricultural work is the predominant form of livelihood. marriage is very early, especially for women, generally right after puberty. And as I tell my students, yeah, Gandhi got married very young. Because you have to remember, I've said this before in other lectures, and I think it's very important. Our notions of what you're supposed to do in life are based on our lifestyle. If you don't have high school and college, or whatever, college and university and medical school, and you have to go get a job, if you're just living in the desert and you're tending goats all day, and you're a boy and you go through puberty, and being a boy, male who's gone through puberty, I can tell you, speak for the rest of the men out there, basically 99.9% of your brain at that point is occupied with sex. And I don't know what the percentage is with women, but I assume that women at some point start getting interested in sex too. And you're sitting out there with goats, and you've got nothing to do. You have no hope in your life of ever doing anything except tending goats. Why in God's name would you not get married? It makes no sense. Of course you should. And they're like, oh, but you're not emotionally mature. What? What is that emotional mature? What does that mean, emotionally mature? This guy doesn't know what emotionally mature is. He doesn't, people don't think about that. Well, what about, power dynamic in the relationship? What? Power dynamic in the relationship? This is all completely anachronistic concepts that we're imposing on the past or on societies that justifiably maybe don't care about this. So the argument, no one mentioned this because it wasn't a concern. And England, interestingly enough, historically has relatively high marriage ages, even in the Middle Ages, in the mid-20s. England's a very odd place historically in that sense. But this starts becoming an issue in the 20th century, and Muslim writers start dealing with it. And the interesting thing is, who are the people who start dealing with this issue first? It's not the ulama. It's people like Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad, the Egyptian prose writer, poet who died in 1964, he's an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist. He's not an Islamist. He's not, he's first and foremost interested in reviving the identity of Egypt, of his community, of his world, of defending it against the West. He sees that appreciating and understanding early Islam is important for that. So he writes lots of books on the Prophet and on the companions. And he's the first person I've seen who takes up this issue of trying to try and figure out a way to argue that Aisha was older. He said she was 14 or 15. But because he's concerned about the image in Western eyes. Because in that point, if you look at fatwas in Egypt, you start getting fatwa requests saying, why is it, isn't it bad that there's an old man marrying a young woman? Shouldn't we have a law against this? Shouldn't we have a law? In 1923, the Egyptian law changes and makes 16 the minimum age for marriage for women. In Syria, around the same time, you get it at 18, 16 or 18. This becomes a big deal in debates over law in Muslim countries, importing Western legal codes. And a lot of ulama fight against these marriage age restrictions, and they only accept them as procedural restrictions. That they say a Sharia marriage is valid, with the agreement is valid at any age. The consummation should only take place when the woman is physically able to bear it, which is the traditional pre-modern Sharia rule. But the ruler, as the ruler, has the right to restrict procedurally what can be registered as a marriage. And you see scholars like Ali Tantawi in Syria, like Abdul Halim Mahmoud in Egypt, who defend the idea of making marriage age 16 or 18 because they feel this is actually a good way to promote social welfare. But you can't say, from a Sharia perspective, you cannot say that what the Prophet did was wrong, because the Prophet can't commit sins.
That wasn't so much an ethical question, but what about hadith that are deemed to be sahih, authentic, which do sometimes go against some ethical precepts that we hold? For example, what about the hadith that talks about the woman's deficiency in her thinking? How do we my difficulty is, when do we start to say, well, then this may be problematic, even though it's actually authentic?
That's a good question. This is the big question. This is the ultimate question, right? Which is, there's a hadith that seems to contradict what I think is reasonable, possible, or right. How do I deal with that? There's a couple of approaches. The sort of traditional Sunni approach would be that God and the Prophet know better on a moral issue. Another approach is also legitimately Islamic and Sunni and Shia. It would be, there are instances, for example, there's a hadith that says, Shahra Eid la yanqusan, in Sunan of Abu Dawud, that 2 months of festival are never short. But Eid and Dhul Hijjah, Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah. But we know that Ramadan and Dhul Hijjah is frequently not 30 days, sometimes they're 29 days. This hadith is on its face false. So what did people like Ibn Hanbal al-Bukhari say? They say, well, it's not literal then. It means either the barakah you get in these months will always be complete, or Ibn Hanbal said they're never both short in the same year, which is wrong. So if you see something that contradicts empirical reality, you just realize that it's figurative. I mentioned this before in other lectures I've given, but the hadith of when the Prophet asks Abu Dhar, do you know where the sun goes after it sets? And he says, God and the Prophet are more knowledgeable. And he says, it goes before the throne of God, and it prostrates and seeks permission to rise again. People in the early 20th century, Muslims who are pious Muslims, they want to believe in their religion. They flip out over this hadith. It makes them, it panics them. There are writers who reject the whole hadith tradition because of hadiths like this. It contradicts clear scientific reality that these early Muslims didn't know. How much more subject to historical contingency can a hadith be? Are we really going to base our religion on ideas that are clearly wrong, that someone believed based on scientific ideas that later turned out to be false? Medieval Muslims, my response is, medieval Muslims also got confused by this hadith because it doesn't make any sense. If you look in Nawawi talks about it, you know, how does the sun prostrate? It doesn't have it's like a ball. What is it? I don't understand how this works. So they say it's figurative. It means it prostrates to God's, that shajaru wa najmu yasjudan. The sun and trees prostrate to God. So people have to. You asked the biggest question in the history of Islamic interpretation, and then you want me to not answer it. So what is it you're trying to say?
So I've got to the gist of your answer. So given what you said to the second question, is it not reasonable then to question the first question on that basis of ethical precepts?
But I didn't answer the full question.
No, I'm just saying that you see it as an option. I'm just saying, not that I believe that it is a question ethically, but I'm saying there are individuals that do see that as an ethical question, and there is a contentious issue there. But given the answer to your second question, that there is actually an option to revisit hadith in this light, because it clearly goes against empirical evidence, then why not apply the same type of reasoning for the first scenario about Aisha's age?
Wait, but I haven't. You need to spend more time on Muslim scholars because they're never going to give you a short answer to a question, and I'm giving you the menu options. You can't ask me to answer the question before I finish answering the question. I'm giving you different options, right? There's possibility. One possibility is you simply say, "Sami'na wa ata'na." God said, "We hear, we obey." The sun prostrates. Okay, the sun prostrates. Fine, it prostrates. I admit it. Or you can say, "Okay, I understand, but it doesn't make sense to me. How does this work?" literally it doesn't work. It contradicts. That's why the 2 months in everyone's short hadith is a great example, because this is something you can't deny. No one is going to debate whether or not the month of Ramadan is 29 or 30 days that year. You can get an astronomical calendar and figure this out. It's not subject to interpretation. The hadith is false on its face. Therefore, it's either not true, the Prophet didn't know what he was talking about, or we interpret it figuratively. The first two options, a Muslim would like to rule out, because they'd like to think that the Prophet speaks the truth. They'd like to think that their science of hadith authentication works. So the third option is taken. You interpret it figuratively, which is totally reasonable, because figurative use of language, according to some scholars like Giambattista Vico in the 1700s, figurative language is the real nature of language. Really, figurative metaphor is how we speak. Literal language is not, literal understanding is a secondary feature. So, there's the problem, however, when you get to ethical issues, because there's no objective standard to measure ethics. There's no objective standard to measure right and wrong. Because right and wrong are different for different people. There's no, what?
I find that.
You don't agree?
No.
Really? You're not an Ashari. You're not, what is, so, who came up with this crazy idea that there's no such thing as universal right and wrong? Which like crazy lunatic came up with this idea? This is Protagoras. This is one of Plato's opponents in Plato's mind, Protagoras. This is what the sophists are accused of not believing in universal rights and wrong. They said right and wrong are relative to what city you're in. Right and wrong are based on convention. They're based on culture, which is exactly what Sunni Muslims say. I don't know about Twelver Shia. I'm not saying, I just don't know the answer to that. Is it right and wrong are conventional? They're based on place and time. And if you want to make universal arguments for that, you better come up with some way to justify that. The Muslim answer is that the universal answers can be provided by Scripture, by revelation from God. Other arguments for universal rights and wrong now are based on things like human rights, universal human rights. The problem with that argument is that they keep adding more human rights, and you sit and wonder that 1 year something's right, and the next 10 years later it's wrong, or vice versa. And so one wonders how truly universal this can be, or to what extent I should be sacrificing my religious values for a system of values that seems to change every decade. Right? And this is, yeah.
I think after you finish on the answers to that question, another question. I think I wrap it up and we'll come back at 2 o'clock.
Sorry, I don't mean to go beyond. He asked this gigantic question. I mean, he should be. So the issue then, I'll be done. I'll finish presently.
Can we do one more question?
So the issue, the question is, how do you determine what's right and wrong? And one has to.
I wasn't arguing for a position. I was just saying, is it reasonable and should be accepted as an opinion, a valid opinion, given the answer to your second question with all the options? Could someone revisit the age of Aisha and say, for ethical reasons, maybe it's not true? That's what I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that, but then my question would be, what motivates you? And this is what people like Ahmed Shakir, who wrote against Abbas al-Qad, wrote. They said, why are you doing this? What you're admitting, what you're saying is that the critics are correct. Where do you get your values, is he saying? Where do you get your values? Do you get them from your religion? Or do you get them from some other culture that, by the way, 10 years ago didn't care about this?
I do find that a bit simplistic.
No, I don't think it's simplistic at all.
Because there are hadith that talk about, for example, the offspring of the adulteress is worse than the adulterer.
And guess what? They don't interpret these. Vast majority of Muslim scholars either say that hadith is false, or they interpret it figuratively.
But why? Because ethically that doesn't make sense.
Because the person, لا تزر وازرة وزر أخرى. How can somebody be blamed for something that is not that they didn't do?
But that's an ethical precept.
That is a Quranic ethical precept.
Yes, of
a Quranic ethical creed that's not one based on external sources.
But hold on, but there's a hadith that actually states that, so we have to balance that out with the precepts that we have, and the Quran speaks about Islamic precepts. I mean, it's an absurd argument, because what you're saying is that effectively we cannot determine and identify justice without revelation. And I just think that when we look at the scholarly discourse, there are some issues that aren't stipulated by the Quran and the Hadith, and they had to use that up of their reason to develop opinions. So I think.
Look, I think if you want to talk about justice or equity in a specific situation, every day we use our reason to come up with what is just or equitable in a specific situation. And we don't necessarily refer to scripture. However, no one is going to argue that my decision in this specific situation should be universally applied to all human beings in all places and all times, retroactively applied to people in the past and used to judge them. That's nonsense. So there's a difference between using reason to come up with justice or equity in a specific situation and saying that it can derive universal principles that should be applied to all. That's what I'm arguing.
I wasn't arguing for absolute morality.
Yeah.
Just one.
Sorry, one more question.
Apologies, but you mentioned two options when it comes to a hadith that you may not be able to reconcile with your current perspective of things. And you said either you take it allegorically or you take it metaphorically, figuratively, you interpret that, or you saying that the Prophet ﷺ what he spoke was nonsense. But nobody says that you can't open the hadith to scrutiny.
Yes.
You earlier mentioned that Dahlawi said everything in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad.
Yeah, I mean that was the third option that I didn't get to mention, which is that you look at the hadith and maybe you decide it's not authentic. But my question is, what is the criterion for deciding it's not authentic?
But could we not employ tools that have developed since, for example, the Sahihain? Since then, we have a corpus of ahadith and tools that have developed to continue to use these newly developing tools to scrutinize existing ahadith that may be taken for granted as being sahih.
Yeah, I mean, some people will probably dislike my answer, but yes, I would take the position that Sheikh Albani said, which is, by the way, Muslim scholars had said for centuries before that, which is that everything is subject to debate. Everything is subject to evaluation. The reason why people rejected his argument and said, you're criticizing the Sahihain, which no one had really objected to before the 1700s, or really the 20th century, is what it meant, what's behind what you're doing. It's not about, if you want to sit and criticize, scholars get together and criticize hadith and Bukhari and Muslim, no one's going to have a problem. What's the problem? The problem is the criticism against Bukhari and Muslim are really criticisms against the Islamic ethical system. The idea of scripture, the idea of religion as being the main reference in your life, the idea that you should overturn things in the past because of fads in the present. That's why there's such defensiveness about those books and defensiveness about reevaluating hadith. It's not because scholars really reject reevaluating hadiths. They never did. But they're afraid that they're opening a door to modern ephemeral fads or ephemeral beliefs overturning centuries of consensus.
Where do you draw the line? Opening the doors to further scrutiny from anybody, wherever it comes from. Why should we be afraid of opening the doors? This whole idea of Sadda Dhara'a.
The reason why you're afraid of opening the doors is because opening the doors causes conflict. And when you open the doors without any kind of control, you get, but people are always saying, you know, there's like the Muslim Martin Luther of the week, like there's the Quran discovery articles, every 6 months there's a new Muslim Martin Luther. Does anyone, I mean, I'm not from, I live in the United States, I don't live in Europe. People remember like what the Protestant Reformation caused. Utter complete chaos, politically and theologically and socially, until people realized that no, you can't just have everybody revalue. You have to have some kind of interpretive control, otherwise the world becomes unmanageable.
But for the people around Dahlawi, for example, they would have taken what he said as written in stone. If Dahlawi said about the Muslim Ahmad was, was acceptable in one way or another, it's sahih, then the people around him would have taken that on board as accepted. Now we're looking at it and say, well, no, we can't. We need to relook at this, reevaluate this. It should continue.
I agree with you. But that we have to recognize that within a religious tradition, there have to be certain controls on interpretation. What you're talking about is a tangential issue. When you're talking about the details, yeah, people can reevaluate to their heart's content. You know, when you're talking about the core, like the Quran, like things that are agreed upon, like there's 5 prayers, or that fornication is prohibited. If you want to open up that to discussion, the religious tradition will cease to exist. It will evaporate. Well, I think it will. I mean, look at look at religion in many European countries, or in urban America. It doesn't mean anything anymore. You know, my hair cutter, he comes and says like, everything's about God, man. It's all about God, God, God. I was like, I didn't want to say it to him, but I said, what does that mean? I mean, it just means nothing. I don't know what it means. Anyway.